Tonight, we have 24 true Halloween horror stories for you, all inspired by real events. A preview of the terror includes a new friendship that takes a dark turn when a man uncovers the horrifying secret his coworker keeps inside his home, a group of boys who discover something awful hidden inside an old tree, unleashing a cryptic mystery that haunts their town for decades, and 4 college students who learn the strange carvings on their rental cabin aren't just random graffiti. You'll want to stick around for that final story, because what's revealed about the original owner's daughter and her connection to those symbols is simply terrifying. When Wilson started his new job, the first few months were a lonely blur of sterile office walls and awkward small talk. He was the new guy in a place where everyone already had their own circles. The company Halloween party was the peak of that isolation. Wilson stood in a cheap zombie costume, nursing a warm beer while the old lights overhead made a constant irritating buzz. The room smelled like stale donuts and burnt coffee, and he was just counting the minutes until he could escape. That's where he met Taylor. Taylor was a senior developer, a guy who moved with an easy confidence, and he had a genuinely killer costume. He rescued Wilson from a corner, and they just clicked, spending the next hour talking about old horror movies. When the party wound down, Taylor clapped him on the shoulder. "Hey man, I gotta get home," he said with a friendly smile. "My girlfriend Nicole, she'll kill me if I'm too late." Wilson just nodded, thinking it was the most normal thing in the world. For the first time, he felt like he might actually fit in. And he did. Over the next 6 or 7 months, Taylor became his best friend at the company. They were a team. They'd bang their heads against the wall on tough projects, then celebrate with a long lunch. Wilson told Taylor about his family, his last breakup, all the dumb stuff. Taylor would listen, laugh at the right spots, and offer solid advice. He was just a good, solid guy. He talked about Nicole here and there, but it was always normal stuff. "Nicole and I tried that new Italian place," or "Nicole's making me watch this terrible reality show." She was just a name, a normal part of his friend's normal life. The friendship felt real, and for Wilson, it was the best part of his job. Then, so slowly you could barely notice it, the little cracks started to show. It started with the phone calls. Wilson had seen Taylor take calls from Nicole 100 times, but one day at lunch, he noticed something. Taylor had his phone pressed to his ear, nodding, that classic, okay, honey look on his face. But the screen was black. Wilson blinked, sure he'd seen it wrong. It was a single, weird detail, the kind of thing your brain immediately tries to erase. But then he saw it again a few weeks later. Taylor at his desk, having another one-sided conversation with a dead screen. A cold little knot tightened in Wilson's stomach. A pattern was forming, and it didn't make any sense. After that, Wilson started to notice other things. Taylor always turned down invitations to hang out. It was never just a simple "no thanks." It was always a specific, detailed excuse about Nicole. "She gets anxious when I'm out late," he'd say one week. "She needs me to stay in and help her with a project," he'd say the next. The stories got stranger. One day, Taylor was talking about his weekend and said, completely seriously, "Yeah, I spent most of Saturday giving Nicole a manicure and doing her hair. She likes to stay pretty." Wilson gave a tight laugh, waiting for the punchline, but Taylor just smiled fondly, like it was the most normal thing in the world. The real shift happened a few months before the next Halloween party. Taylor's car was in the shop, so Wilson gave him a ride home. The second Taylor got in the car, Wilson's nostrils were hit with a strange, sickly sweet smell. It was floral, but with a heavy chemical and metallic note underneath that made the back of his throat itch. "Whoa, man, what's that smell?" Wilson asked. Taylor just shrugged. "Oh, probably just Nicole's perfume. It's a little strong, I know." He said it so casually, but the smell wasn't just strong. It was unnatural. Then came the second Halloween party, almost a year to the day since they'd met. Wilson's phone rang. It was Taylor, his voice buzzing with a weird high-strung energy. "Hey man, I'm not gonna make the work party," he said. "I'm having my own little party here with Nicole. She's all dressed up, and I really want you to finally meet her. She's been dying to say hello." Every alarm bell in Wilson's head was screaming, but what could he do? This was his best friend. After a year of excuses, he had to know. "Yeah, sure, man. I'll swing by," he heard himself say. He drove to Taylor's house with a feeling of absolute dread. He pulled up to the quiet, dark house, and that smell hit him the second he opened the car door, thicker than ever. He knocked. Taylor opened the door, his eyes wide, a stressed-out smile plastered on his face. He pulled Wilson into a living room that was impossibly clean, and sitting on the couch, perfectly still, was a woman in a white wedding dress. "Wilson," Taylor said, his voice trembling with pride. "This is Nicole." For a split second, Wilson's brain tried to fix it. It's a mannequin, he thought, a joke, a really, really elaborate Halloween prop. He took a step closer, forcing a smile, and that's when he saw it. The skin wasn't plastic. It had a waxy, chalky texture. The eyes were glass, reflecting the light with a dead, empty stare. He saw the faint glint of wire around her neck, holding her head at a perfect, rigid angle. The sight of it, the waxy skin, the dead eyes, it was exactly like seeing his cousin in a casket years ago. The horror was absolute. This wasn't a prop. It was a body. He mumbled something, an excuse about an emergency, and fled. He ran to his car, his heart hammering against his ribs, and called 911 with hands that could barely hold the phone. He sat in his car and watched the street fill up with flashing lights. He didn't need the news to tell him the story. He just kept replaying the last year in his head. The laughs, the lunches, the friendship he thought was real. All of it a lie. A performance for the benefit of a dead thing on a couch. It's the kind of thing that messes with your head, makes you start looking for answers. Wilson did. He started reading, trying to figure out how a person could be so empty inside. And what he found is the part that really gets you. You learn that the real monsters, the full-blown psychopaths, are maybe 1 in 100. But in a place like an office, that number can be as high as 1 in 25. The part that sticks with Wilson, the part that keeps him up at night, is that some doctors think almost a third of everybody has a piece of that darkness in them. 1 in 3. It makes you look at everyone a little differently now. Taylor seemed so normal. He was a good friend. It makes you wonder about the person you share a joke with, the one you have lunch with every day. How well do you really know them? How can you ever be sure what they go home to? For 4 college kids from Phoenix, Halloween was a tradition. It wasn't about parties. For 19-year-olds Lee, Baker, Greg, and Evans, it was an annual test of nerve. Their mission was to find a place steeped in dark history and see if they could scare themselves. This year, they chose a spot they'd read about in a dusty old book, the legendary Apache Death Cave. They knew the story. In 1878, Apache warriors were trapped in the cave by their enemies. A fire was set at the entrance, and every soul inside perished. Locals claimed the place was tainted, that if you went deep enough, You could still hear strange sounds echoing from the rock. Baker, the group's self-appointed leader, had a theory. The book mentioned a hidden lower chamber where the final stand took place. Their goal was to find that chamber, to see for themselves if the legends were true. They arrived at the ghost town of Two Guns under a vast Arizona sky. The ruins of an old roadside zoo stood silently in the fading light. The wind made a low, mournful sound as it scraped over the broken buildings. They found the cave, a dark mouth in the side of a hill, and descended the rickety wooden ramp into the earth. The first thing they noticed was the cold. It was a deep, unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The second was the smell, a faint, sour odor like spoiled meat mixed with sulfur, a scent that came and went on a breeze that shouldn't exist. They pushed deeper, their flashlight beams cutting through a darkness so absolute it felt like it was pressing in on them. They were laughing and joking at first, their voices echoing unnaturally. Baker was leading the way, calling out directions, while Greg lagged behind, already unnerved by the oppressive silence. They had been walking for nearly an hour when they heard the first sound, a distant, scraping noise. It sounded like a heavy stone being dragged across the cave floor. They stopped, and the sound stopped with them. They started walking again, and after a few moments the scraping started again. It was methodical. It felt like it was pacing them. A seed of real fear began to sprout, chilling the bravado between them. The cave was a labyrinth. The main passage branched off into smaller tunnels, forcing them to crawl and squeeze through narrow gaps. The air grew thick and hard to breathe. They started hearing whispers. They were faint, mixed with the sound of the wind, but Greg swore he heard his name called, a dry hiss from the darkness just beyond his flashlight beam. Evans felt a sudden, slick dampness on the rock wall, even though the rest of the cave had been bone dry. Every detail felt wrong. Then the breathing started. It wasn't an animal. It was a distinct rattling sound, like the last, painful breaths of several dying people. It was coming from all around them. That's when the scream echoed down the passage from the darkness ahead. It was not a prank. It was a short, choked-off cry of pure animal terror. It was followed by a silence so profound it roared in their ears. In that silence, they saw it. The beam of Lee's flashlight, which had been pointed down the tunnel, suddenly jerked sideways and then went out. Not a flicker. Just gone. They were paralyzed. Evans, who had been standing next to Lee, was just staring at the empty space where his friend had been. His face was a mask of horror, his mouth open in a silent scream. A wet, shuffling sound started up from the darkness, and the smell of sulfur and rot was suddenly overwhelming. That broke the spell. No one said a word. There was no plan. There was only a shared, shameful look that passed between Baker, Greg, and Evans. It was a look of pure animal panic. It was a silent agreement that they were not heroes. They turned and ran. It wasn't a clean escape. It was a frantic, clumsy scramble over rocks and through tight spaces. Greg fell, scraping his hands raw on the stone. He could hear the wet, shuffling sound behind them, keeping a steady pace. He didn't dare look back. The fear was a physical thing, a cold weight in his stomach that told him if he looked, his heart would stop. They burst out of the cave mouth, gasping in the cold night air, collapsing near the car. The silence of the desert was a deafening contrast to the chaos of the cave. They stood for a long, agonizing moment, chests heaving, listening, waiting. Lee did not emerge. The horrible, unspoken truth hung in the air between them. They were leaving. The drive back was a new kind of hell. The car, once a symbol of escape, now felt like a coffin. No one spoke. The radio was off. The only sound was the hum of the tires on the asphalt and their own ragged breathing. Greg stared out the window at the passing darkness, his mind replaying the moment Lee's light went out. He replayed their silent decision to run. He tried to build a story in his head, a lie he could live with. He was probably right behind us. He'll find his way out. What could we have done? The justifications were flimsy, pathetic things, and they dissolved in the face of the horrifying, pounding guilt in his chest. A pair of hikers found Lee 2 days later, huddled near the cave entrance. He was shivering and unresponsive, his eyes wide and vacant. He was alive, but whatever he saw in that cave had silenced him forever. The doctors found no physical reason for it, but Lee could no longer speak. The friend group shattered. They couldn't look at each other without seeing their own failure, their own cowardice. Greg still thinks about that night all the time, haunted by the question of what was in that cave. Was it a person, an animal, or something else? The not knowing is a kind of torture. But the worst part is visiting Lee and seeing the question that his old friend can never ask out loud, but that Greg sees in his silent, haunted eyes every single day. Why did you leave me? It's a question Greg will have to answer for the rest of his life. The air on Halloween back in the late 90s was a heavy thing, thick with the smell of cheap candy and bonfire smoke. Anthony was 17, walking with his 2 friends, Ebony and Terrence, down a cracked sidewalk in their corner of Detroit. The whole neighborhood felt alive with a restless energy. The distant sound of sirens, the rumble of bass from passing cars, and the high-pitched laughs of little kids running wild in the streets. Ebony, their unspoken leader, was getting impatient with the boys' pace, teasing them for walking too slow. Terrence was dragging his feet, visibly nervous, mentioning his mother's warnings about this particular street being a no-go after dark. Anthony stayed quiet, watching. That was his role. He watched the wind lift discarded candy wrappers from the gutter and felt the autumn cold seeping up through the soles of his worn sneakers. This was home, a chaotic, loud place where you learned to keep your head on a swivel. As they walked, the sounds of life began to fade behind them, block by block. The laughter and music grew distant until it was just a faint, rhythmic pulse. They were hitting the quiet part of the neighborhood now, the part of town the city seemed to have forgotten. It was a part of the city where people could slip through the cracks. Over the years, stories would pop up and then fade away, about drifters or homeless guys who were regulars at the soup kitchen one week and gone the next. People just vanished. There were never any official reports, no news stories. They were just erased. In a neighborhood with so many problems, a few missing forgotten men didn't make a sound. The streetlights here were mostly shattered, their metal posts standing like skeletal fingers pointing at the dark sky. The houses stood dark and empty, their yards overgrown with weeds that clawed at the peeling paint. The block felt dead. Up on the far corner, an old 2-story house loomed over everything. You could tell it had been grand once, a long time ago. Now its paint was peeling like old dead skin, and its windows were all boarded up. It looked like a skull, empty and watching. This was the target. This was Dr. Finch's house. The stories about the old man began to surface in the quiet between them. Anthony had his own memories of him. He'd seen him a few times on his block, and he remembered the man's physical presence. He was a black man, unnaturally thin, with a tall, stooped frame that looked like it could be snapped by a strong wind. His skin was the color of old parchment, dry and stretched taut over his sharp cheekbones. He wore thick, round glasses that magnified his eyes, making them look like they were floating, detached and analytical, and he was never without that small black leather medical bag. He never looked at anyone, but Anthony always felt like the old man knew he was being watched. The dare had been Ebony's idea. Just walk up to the back of the house, touch the door, and leave. A simple test of courage against a local ghost story. As they got closer, the last faint sounds of the city seemed to vanish completely. The silence was heavy, oppressive, like the house was sucking all the noise out of the air. It got cold, too. A sudden, bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Then the smell hit them. It was a sickening scent, a mix of rotting flowers and something sterile, like a hospital where they had forgotten to turn on the air. It was a smell that had no business being there. That's when they saw the light, just a thin sliver of yellow glowing from a gap in a boarded-up window around back. The dare was immediately forgotten. They had to see. They crept toward it, the chest-high weeds snapping under their feet like tiny bones. They reached the window and peered inside. Anthony was expecting to see some cheap Halloween decorations. A plastic skeleton, maybe. What they saw was real. A single bare bulb hung from a wire, putting a sick yellow haze on everything. Its old filament made a faint, dry, crackling sound, the only noise in the room besides a soft, rhythmic scraping, methodical and wet. A man in a stained white lab coat stood over a gurney. It was Dr. Finch. His back was to them. On the gurney lay a man they all knew, a homeless veteran everyone called Preacher. He had been missing for weeks. He wasn't moving, his hands and feet tied down. His head was turned to the side, his vacant eyes staring at the ceiling. They were completely empty, hollow things with no light or life in them at all. Anthony's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He wanted to scream, but his throat was locked. The doctor moved, not toward them, but to a shelf on the wall. It was lined with glass jars. Inside each one, a small, pale, fleshy object was floating in some kind of cloudy liquid. Anthony's mind screamed in protest as he saw the crude, handwritten labels on the jars. Smokey. Pop's, Preacher. His brain tried to rationalize it all away, but there wasn't one. The truth hit him like a physical blow. Those weren't just specimens. They were pieces of a human brain, and he was looking at the latest victim of the doctor's gruesome hobby. The smell, he realized now, was not of chemicals, but of human decay. It was a smell he would never forget, a sickeningly sweet odor that was already taking root deep in his mind. Terence, pressed against the house, made a small sound, a choked gasp. The doctor froze, his hand on a jar. He tilted his head as if listening, and then he turned. It was not a sudden movement. It was slow and deliberate, as if he had known they were there the entire time. His eyes found the dark gap in the window, and a thin, tight smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. Panic exploded. The boys scrambled backward, away from the house, away from the pale, fleshy things in the jars. They didn't stop until they were back on a well-lit street, the sounds of normal Halloween fun filling the night. Ebony, trying to act tough, swore it was all just fake Halloween stuff. But she was white as a ghost, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. Anthony knew better. He had seen the empty eyes of Preacher, the little piece of his mind floating in the jar. He ran home, the terror chasing him, the sounds of his frantic feet slapping against the concrete. His parents, still in their living room, smiled when they saw him. They told him it was just a bad Halloween nightmare. He ran out of the house, desperate, and tried to tell the police, but they just shook their heads and told him to go home. He was a kid in a forgotten part of town, and no one was going to listen to a story about a doctor and jars of brains. The house and its secrets were invisible to the world. Years later, Anthony is a man. He joined the military and left that neighborhood behind him, seeing things in the world that no boy from Detroit should ever have to see. He is a successful man now, far from the scared kid who once ran down that street. But every Halloween, when the familiar smell of a bonfire drifts on the cold night air, the other smell returns to him. He remembers the cold, the sickly sweetness, the vacant eyes of the man on the gurney, and the tiny, pale piece of his mind floating in a jar. The house was eventually demolished, and the lot was paved over, its sinister secrets never discovered. But Anthony knows he never truly escaped, because the real horror wasn't a ghost or a monster under the bed. The real horror was that a man of madness and science, a quiet killer, was hidden in plain sight, preying on people who were already forgotten. And that, Anthony knows, is a secret he will carry for the rest of his life. That Halloween, back in 1972, was a wet one in that part of Louisiana. The air was thick and smelled of wet leaves and dirt. A low fog sat on the ground, making the streetlights just a blurry glow in the distance. It was the kind of night that seemed to swallow up sound. There were 4 boys out that night: Sam, Charlie, Wilson, and Owen. They were all middle schoolers, around 12 or 13 years old enough to feel brave, but too young to know any better. They were on their way home, their plastic pumpkins full of candy that made a crinkling sound with every step they took. They were taking a shortcut along the edge of the woods, a path their parents had told them to stay away from. Sam, the oldest, had the only good flashlight, and he cut a white line through the dark. The usual chatter between the boys died down the deeper into the trees they went. Soon the only sound was the squish of their sneakers in the mud. Every time a twig snapped underfoot, all 4 of them would jump. The trees were so thick that the lights from the neighborhood houses were gone. It was just the 4 of them and the beam from Sam's flashlight bouncing around in the dark. He was acting brave, shining it up at the branches, making them look like they were reaching for them. Then the light stopped on the old oak. Everyone in town knew that tree. It was ancient, bigger than any other, with a wide black hollow at the base that looked like a cave. Sam, who was always pushing things, got a look in his eye. "Bet you won't stick your hand in," he whispered to the others. Charlie just gave a nervous laugh. "No way. I'll do better." He took the flashlight from Sam and walked right up to the hollow. He was putting on a show for the others, trying to act tough. He pointed the light inside, and the other 3 boys leaned in to see. The beam lit up a mess of spiderwebs and old dead leaves. Then it caught something else, something white. At first, none of them could make sense of it. A boy's mind thought it was a piece of trash, maybe a broken plastic bucket someone had dumped in there. It was smooth and pale. Charlie moved the light up, and they all saw the 2 dark holes, eye sockets. Then the grin of teeth right below them. It was a skull. The light moved down, and the rest of it came into view. A rib cage, hips, all of it folded up in a sitting position. And then they saw it. Long, dark strands of hair were still tangled in the bones of the skull, catching the flashlight beam. That's how they knew. It was a woman. For a long second, nobody moved. Nobody made a sound. Then Charlie let out a choked sort of gasp and scrambled backward, tripping and falling into the mud. That broke the spell. The boys turned and ran. They didn't scream. There wasn't any air in their lungs to scream. It was just a mad dash, branches whipping their faces, their feet sucking in the mud. They didn't stop until they hit the pavement of the street and fell down, gasping for air under a streetlight. The police came, the body was removed, and the case eventually went cold. Life was supposed to go on, but it couldn't. Months later, A message was found scrawled in chalk on the wall of the diner. Who is she? Everyone just figured it was some teenagers making a sick joke. The police came and washed it off, but it left people feeling uneasy. A year after that, another message showed up. This time, it was spray-painted on an old car rusting out by the railroad tracks. Who's next? That one was different. It wasn't a question about the past. It was a threat about the future. It sent a wave of real fear through the town. People started locking their doors more often, and then nothing. The direct threat was left hanging in the air with no follow-up. A year went by, then another. After 5 years of absolute silence, people started to relax. After 10, the locks came off the doors. After 15 years, the story was just that, a story. A dark piece of local history that people told to spook newcomers, but the fear was gone. Life had returned to normal. The boys grew up. They became men with jobs and families of their own. Owen hadn't truly thought about that night in years. The memory was sharp, but it was distant, like a scene from a movie he'd seen a long time ago. One afternoon, he was walking with his own son past an old alley. It had been a full 15 years since the last strange message had appeared on a wall. His eyes drifted to the crumbling brick, and he saw it. Fresh and white in dripping paint were 3 words. I'm still here. The air left his lungs. A cold shock, hard and fast, went through him. For a split second he was 12 years old again, standing in the dark, smelling the mud and the rot. The thought screamed in his head, holy crap, he's still here. But then another thought crashed right behind it. Wait a second, it's been 15 years, 15 years of nothing. He stared at the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. This could be a prank, some kid who heard the story. It has to be. The town was full of ghosts. Maybe he was just seeing another one. The thought that he was just crazy, that the past had scarred him so badly, that he was seeing monsters in random graffiti, was almost as terrifying as the alternative. He didn't know what to believe. But as he stood there, frozen in that alley, the doubt did nothing to quiet his breathing or slow his pulse. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Whether the killer was real or just a phantom in his own mind, the terror was the same. He was scared, and he knew deep down that he would never feel safe in that town again. In that part of Pennsylvania, the towns are small and the woods are big. Halloween wasn't just a holiday. It was a serious piece of business. Every house had decorations, and every kid knew the story of the phantom trick-or-treater. It was a local legend, the kind of thing people tell to give the town some flavor. The story went that a little girl in a witch costume, lost years and years ago, would show up on Halloween night. She wouldn't speak. She'd just take candy left out on a porch and disappear back into the trees. It was a ghost story, something to make you look over your shoulder, but nobody believed it was real. Baker, Tyler, and Jennifer sure didn't. They were teenagers who had their feet planted firmly on the ground, too old for ghost stories. They sat on Baker's porch steps, passing a bag of candy back and forth, while the little kids ran up and down the street. The night air was cold and smelled like burning leaves. You could hear everything. Kids yelling down the block, the rustle and scrape of plastic costumes, and the crunch of parents' boots on the gravel sidewalks. It was the normal, predictable sound of Halloween. And then everything got quiet. Not all at once, but in a strange, focused way. The noise from the street just seemed to get distant. Baker looked up toward the edge of his property, where the manicured lawn gave way to the deep, dark woods. A figure was standing there perfectly still, right where the shadows were thickest. It was a little girl wearing a simple black witch costume with a pointed hat that hid her face. She didn't move. She didn't make a sound. The other trick-or-treaters, buzzing on sugar and excitement, walked right past her like she was a mailbox. The three friends just stared. The only sounds they could hear now were the buzz of the porch light above their heads and the soft whisper of the wind blowing dead leaves across the asphalt. The girl took one slow step forward, out of the deepest shadow, and held out a small hand. Jennifer, always the bold one, stood up, grabbed a handful of chocolates, and walked to the edge of the porch. Her sneakers made a soft, shuffling sound on the concrete. She dropped the candy into the girl's hand. The girl's fingers closed around it slowly. She didn't say thank you. She just turned around and started walking back toward the woods. In seconds, the darkness between the trees swallowed her whole. Tyler was shaking his head. "No way," he whispered, his voice tight. "We are not following her." But Baker was already on his feet, driven by a practical need to understand what was going on. It had to be a prank, and he wanted to see the strings. "It's the legend," he said, a challenge in his voice. "We have to see where she goes." He didn't wait for an answer, just took off at a jog across the lawn. Jennifer was right behind him. Tyler let out a frustrated sigh, the sound loud in the sudden quiet. But he wasn't about to let his friends go into those woods alone. He ran to catch up. The moment they stepped under the canopy of the trees, the last of the town's sounds vanished. It was like closing a heavy door. There was no more shouting, no more cars, nothing. The only sounds were their own. The loud snap of a twig under Baker's shoe, the sharp crunch of leaves under their feet, the sound of their own breath, which was starting to come out in white puffs in the cold air. The temperature had dropped, a deep chill that felt like it was coming up from the ground itself. Baker clicked on a heavy flashlight he'd grabbed, its yellow beam cutting a shaky tunnel through the pitch black. Up ahead, they could just make out the girl in the witch costume. She moved without a sound, a gliding shape that never seemed to get much further away, but never let them get any closer. She never once looked back. They walked deeper, into a part of the woods none of them recognized. The trees here were old and thick, their branches interlocking high above to block out the stars and the moon. The flashlight beam was the only light in the entire world. And then the last of the sounds died. No crickets, no rustling of animals in the underbrush. Nothing. The silence was so complete, so heavy, it felt like pressure against their eardrums. All they could hear was the frantic, panicked drumming of their own hearts and the ragged sound of their own breathing. Then the girl stopped. She was standing in a small circular clearing. Her back was to them. She seemed to be looking down at something on the ground. The area was marked by a low circle of stones, mostly covered in moss and tangled with dead vines. Baker moved the flashlight beam over it. It was an old well. The girl turned her head just slightly, a dark shape against the bright light. And then she was gone. She didn't run. She didn't fade away. One moment she was standing there, and the next the space was empty. The three of them stood frozen, the cold air burning their lungs. Fear, real and sharp, had settled over them. Baker's hand was shaking, but he forced himself to move the beam of the flashlight from the empty space where the girl had been, down into the black, gaping mouth of the well. The light sliced through the darkness, hitting the slick, mossy stones of the wall and then the murky, still water at the bottom. And then they saw it. Bobbing gently near a rusted pipe was a small object. It was a child's plastic shoe, the cheap kind you get with a Halloween costume. Next to it, half buried in the silt and grime, was a small tin lunchbox, its metal sides dark with rust. They didn't scream. They just backed away slowly, then turned and ran. They crashed through the woods, not caring about the branches that whipped at their faces or the noise they made. They just ran until they burst out of the tree line and back into the familiar, welcome light of the street lamps. They ran straight into Baker's house, gasping for air, their faces pale. Baker's parents were in the living room, and the three teenagers tried to get the story out between ragged breaths. At first, the adults thought it was a Halloween prank, kids high on sugar and ghost stories, letting their imaginations run wild. But then Jennifer's dad, who was a cop, came over to pick her up. He saw the look on their faces and knew it was more than a joke. He sat them down and listened to every detail, his professional skepticism slowly eroding as they all told the exact same impossible tale. He was still ready to dismiss it, right up until they described the shoe and the lunchbox. That's when his expression changed. He went out alone. When the back door finally opened again, he stumbled in, his boots covered in mud. The color was gone from his face. He looked straight through the kids, his eyes fixed on something they couldn't see. He picked up his radio, and the voice he used was flat, all the authority shocked right out of it. It was the voice of a man reporting a fact his brain refused to process. The next day, the town's ghost story became a police investigation. The yellow tape and heavy equipment were real, the well was real, and the body they pulled from it was tragically real. It was all a straightforward, explainable tragedy. Except for one part. Baker, Tyler, and Jennifer don't believe in ghosts. To this day, they will tell you that. They are sensible people. They tried to explain it away for years. A prank that coincidentally led them to a forgotten well. A shared hallucination. But no real-world explanation ever fit. How could a prank know where to go? How could three people have the exact same vision? They were left with the impossible truth. They don't believe in ghosts, but they swear they saw one. They live in a world governed by cause and effect, but they were guided through the dark by something that shouldn't exist. The sightings of the phantom trick-or-treater stopped for good, but for the three of them, the story never ended. They were left with a cold, hard fact that science couldn't explain, and a memory that reason could never, ever erase. Secrets in rural Virginia have a way of festering, but some memories refuse to stay buried. For a teenager named Lydia, one chilly Halloween night became a 2-year lesson in the kind of terror that never truly fades, twisting a local tradition into a profound and lingering question mark on her life. It was 1993. Autumn air carried the scent of distant wood smoke and the sweet decay of fallen leaves. Inside Lydia's home, the radio crackled, tuned to WMLD, the town's small station. Every Halloween, its reclusive owner, a man named Monroe, hosted a special broadcast of classic horror radio dramas. It was a familiar, if slightly odd, tradition. Lydia was in her room, a cassette recorder with its plastic gears whirring quietly by the speaker, ready to capture the sounds of the night. A story of a phantom manor played out, its drama filling the room. But just as the clock on her nightstand showed the time as 11:47 p.m., the spell was broken. A sharp, loud burst of static sliced through the calm like a razor. It was immediately followed by a message, spoken in a child's voice that was unnervingly clear. "Meet me at the abandoned movie theater at midnight." The phrase repeated itself, clean and sterile, without any of the background hiss of a normal broadcast. Then, just as suddenly, it was gone. The Phantom Manor story resumed as if it had never been interrupted. Lydia and her friends thought it was a brilliant prank. They laughed about it on the phone, wondering who could be so clever. But curiosity is a powerful force. A few minutes before midnight, Lydia slipped out, the beam of her flashlight cutting a nervous circle on the dark pavement. The walk to the edge of town was quiet, the usual nighttime sounds of crickets and distant cars seeming to hold their breath. The moon was hidden by thick clouds, and the abandoned movie theater grew from a shape in the distance to a hulking black silhouette. Its marquee was a skeleton of rusted metal, and the posters in the glass cases were faded ghosts of films long forgotten. A shiver ran down her spine, but she told herself it was just the cold and the thrill of the adventure. She waited, her breath puffing out in white clouds. Midnight came and went with only the sound of the wind rustling through dead leaves and rattling a loose piece of siding on the theater's roof. She did a full circuit of the building, shining her light into the shattered, empty eyes of its windows and the boarded-up main entrance. There was nothing. The excitement of the prank quickly faded, replaced by the quiet disappointment of a story with no ending. Feeling a little foolish, she walked back home. Over the next year, the memory softened. It became a funny story she'd tell, a quirky local mystery that was hers alone. The tape with the strange message was recorded over with music, and the eerie feeling of that night was buried under the weight of everyday teenage life. She almost forgot about it entirely. Then Halloween of 1994 arrived. Lydia was home again, the radio once more tuned to Monroe's gravelly voice. And then, at the exact same moment, 11:47 p.m., it happened again. The sharp burst of static. The same child's voice, just as clear, just as eerie. "Meet me at the abandoned movie theater at midnight." This time, the feeling was completely different. There was no thrill, no sense of a fun mystery. This felt personal, an unsettling secret meant only for her. This time, she wasn't looking for a prankster to laugh with. She was looking for an answer. She grabbed a heavier coat and made her way out into the night. The walk felt longer this year. Every rustle in the trees, every scrape of a branch on the pavement made her flinch. The moon was out, a sharp sliver of white light that cast long, skeletal shadows. It illuminated a lonely figure standing just outside the broken double doors of the theater. The figure wore a long black cloak and a ghost-face mask. Lydia's mind raced. This was it, the prankster. She took a step forward, ready to confront them, but a sudden, intense wave of wrongness washed over her. The figure wasn't moving. It wasn't waving or shifting its weight. It was perfectly, unnaturally still, the cheap plastic of the mask catching the moonlight in a blank, distorted grin. It held what looked like a prop knife, but it held it with a strange seriousness, pointed down at the ground. Then its masked head tilted slowly to the side, a gesture of cold curiosity. In a smooth, deliberate movement, the figure raised the knife and began to walk toward her. It was a slow, gliding motion, and the most terrifying part was the silence. She could hear no sound of footsteps on the gravel driveway, no crunch of fallen leaves. Her rational brain screamed that it was a fake knife, a costume, a silly game. But her body didn't listen. A deep, primal fear took over. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. She didn't stay to see if the walk would turn into a run. She turned and fled, her feet pounding against the cold asphalt, her breath catching in her throat like a sob. She ran faster than she ever had in her life, not daring to look back. The broadcast never happened again. No news stories ever appeared. There was no town gossip, no whispers of a strange incident at the radio station or the old movie theater. The event simply vanished into the silence of the past, a secret Lydia never shared with a single soul. She would lie awake for years, replaying those 2 Halloweens, trying to decide what was real. Was it just a prankster who took a joke too far? Or was it a real threat she had barely escaped? It was just a normal Halloween night, a little chilly. You had kids running around, bags so full of candy they were dragging on the ground. The usual stuff. Josh and his friends were just walking, listening to the leaves crunch under their shoes. Everything was fine. So, the first time they saw the guy, it wasn't even a thing. He was just standing in some person's yard, mostly in the dark. They saw something shiny on his costume and figured he was a robot or something. They grabbed their candy and left. Didn't think about it again. A couple more houses went by. But then things started to get quiet. You know how you can just get a feeling? Nothing you can point to, just something feels off. The friends stopped joking around so much. It felt like they were the only people out on the street all of a sudden. Then they saw him again, at the edge of another lawn, a few houses ahead. It was the same guy, same shiny costume, standing completely still. That's when one of them stopped walking. "Hey," he said real quiet. "Didn't we just see that guy?" Everyone stopped. They all looked down the street at the person. He wasn't moving, not even turning his head to look at them. He was just a statue. Another friend tried to laugh it off. "It's probably just a decoration, man. A really good one." But nobody was laughing. It didn't look like a decoration. It looked like a person. And it was definitely closer than the last one. A seed of real dread started to plant itself in their guts. This is where the night changed from fun to something else. They decided to test it. They'd cut down the next side street and walk fast for a block, then come back out on the main road. There was no way he could get ahead of them then. It was a silent agreement. No one said, "Let's run," but their pace picked up. The sound of their sneakers on the pavement was faster now, louder in the quiet. They turned the corner out of his line of sight and started to jog. They ran for a full block, their costumes rustling and their breath getting heavy. Then they slowed down, turned the next corner, and looked. The street was empty. A wave of relief washed over them. It was nothing. Just a dumb prank, a weird decoration. They started laughing, feeling stupid for being so scared. And then they saw him. He was 3 blocks down, on the same side of the street, standing at the edge of another lawn, just as still as before. But he was there, ahead of them. It was impossible. The laughter died in their throats. The cold feeling came back, 10 times worse than before. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a decoration. This was something else. This was wrong. The walk home after that was the longest of their lives. Josh had his house keys out, gripping them so tight the metal dug into his palm. They didn't talk. They just walked in a tight group, right down the middle of the street, as far away from the dark yards and porches as they could get. Every rustle of leaves, every porch light that flickered, made them jump. Every dark shadow looked like him. They kept looking over their shoulders, down side streets, expecting to see him, but he was never there. The real fear was looking forward. They were so scared to turn a corner and see that silent, shiny person waiting for them again. Finally, they saw it. Josh's house. It was dark, but it was familiar. It was safe. Josh ran ahead, fumbling for his keys. His hands were shaking so bad he dropped them on the porch. The jingle of the keys hitting the wood was like an alarm bell in the silence. He scooped them up, shoved the key in the lock. For a second, that felt like a year. It wouldn't turn. Then finally, a click. They tumbled inside, slamming the heavy front door and throwing the deadbolt. The sound of it sliding home was the best sound in the world. They didn't stop there. They ran through the house, locking every window, pulling every shade down. They were panting, out of breath, a pile of candy bags forgotten by the door. They were home. They were safe. At least, that's what they thought. After a minute, one of them crept to the living room window and pulled the curtain back just a crack. He looked out at the driveway, and all the blood drained from his face. He was there, standing at the very end of the driveway, right under the streetlight. He wasn't moving. He wasn't walking toward the house. He was just standing there. His head was tilted, and his face wasn't a face. It was a perfect, smooth mirror, reflecting the streetlights and the dark houses. It wasn't a mask. It was just a blank, reflective surface. And in that mirror, they could see a tiny, twisted reflection of their own house, their own window, their own terrified faces staring back at them. Pure panic took over. Josh grabbed his phone, his hands shaking so bad he could barely hit the right icon. He called his dad. The sound of the phone ringing echoed in the dead silent room. It rang and rang. Outside, the person didn't move. He just stood there, a perfectly calm reflection of their terror. The phone stopped. Voicemail. Josh looked down at the screen, his face lit up by the small, useless light. When he looked back up, his heart stopped. The driveway was empty. He was gone. The next half an hour was a special kind of hell. They were huddled on the couch in the dark. It wasn't the fear of an attack. It was the fear of the unknown, the waiting. The silence was the worst part. It was so complete that you could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Every creak of the house settling was him. Every tap of a branch on a window was him. They argued in whispers. "Did you lock the back door?" "Yes, I locked it." "Are you sure?" It was a quiet, suffocating fear that filled every corner of the house. The sound of a car engine pulling into the driveway made them all flinch, but then they saw the familiar headlights. Josh's parents were home. Normalcy came back the second the lights came on, and the door opened. They tried to explain what happened, but the words sounded crazy. "There was a guy, and he was following us, and his face was a mirror." It sounded like a story a little kid would make up. They were safe, but the feeling never left. Even now, years later, it's still there. The neighborhood never looked the same after that night. The dark between the houses, the shadows under the streetlights, they all felt different. You don't forget something like that. You just learn to live with the fact that some things don't have an explanation. And you never, ever look too closely at your own reflection in a dark window at night. On some streets, the loudest sound is the silence. It isn't just an absence of noise, but a heavy physical presence, a quiet that holds the memory of a sound that was stolen. On one such street in a blue-collar suburb, that silence began on Halloween night, 1993. Before the quiet came, there was noise. The night was a rich tapestry of excitement. The cool, crisp air carried the scents of wood smoke from distant fireplaces and the cloying, sugary sweetness of candy. The sounds of the neighborhood were full of life. The cheap, rustling plastic of a dozen different costumes, the happy crinkling of cellophane from candy bags, and the high-pitched squeals of children's laughter echoing under the orange glow of the streetlights. On one lawn, a party was in full swing. Parents stood with drinks in their hands, their voices full of easy conversation as their children ran in small, chaotic packs from one decorated house to the next. Among them was a boy with a small frame and a bright imagination. His costume was a simple white sheet with 2 holes cut out for eyes. He was a ghost, a common sight on a night like this, a detail so utterly mundane it was completely unremarkable. He had already made one trip around the block with a visiting friend, his plastic pumpkin now half full. He returned to the porch, bouncing on his feet with a sugary energy. He pointed down the street, toward a house that was always a little too dark, a place the neighborhood kids instinctively skipped. It was a weird home, the kind of place that rarely saw its neighbors. The boy's parents, lulled by the festive atmosphere and the illusion of safety, didn't think twice. They watched their small white ghost make his way down the drive for a second round. They smiled, then turned back to their friends, their laughter mixing with the cheerful sounds of the perfect autumn night. Minutes later, the spell was broken. A child's voice, not panicked or loud, but simple and matter-of-fact, sliced through the happy chaos. Brian never came back. The mother's world tilted. The pleasant buzz from her drink was gone, instantly replaced by a hollow, sickening feeling in her stomach. Her blood didn't run cold. It rushed, a frantic, icy current through her veins. She stared at the house on the corner. It was still dark, still silent, a black hole in a string of brightly lit porches. Then she began to run. Her own heartbeat was a frantic drum in her ears, drowning out the sounds of the party as it faded behind her. She didn't realize until she was halfway down the block that she had no shoes on, that the only thing she could feel was the hard, cold shock of the asphalt against the bare soles of her feet. The father, seeing the pure animal fear on her face, ran after her. His mind struggled to catch up with the sudden, violent shift in reality. The music, the shouting children, the distant sound of a car passing, all of it receded, leaving only the sound of their frantic, slapping footsteps on the pavement. They reached the door and pounded on it. The heavy thud seemed to make no sound at all, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the house. They screamed the boy's name, their voices raw and desperate, but the house offered no reply. The father twisted the doorknob, but it was locked tight. The silence felt like a physical weight, pressing down, making it hard to breathe. He suddenly broke away, sprinting back toward their own house, his legs moving on pure adrenaline. He threw open the door and fumbled in the dark for the phone on the small wall table. In 1993, there were no cell phones in every pocket. Help was not instant. His thumb shook as he punched the numbers into the keypad, his hands suddenly clammy with sweat. The phone rang, its tinny sound echoing in his own empty house, a strange and lonely noise under his wife's muffled shouts from down the street. A calm dispatcher's voice answered, but his mind was screaming, unable to form a coherent thought. All he could say was the address, over and over, his voice cracking. 10 minutes later, the police arrived. The flashing red and blue lights washed over the street in a silent, strobing panic. The officers used a battering ram. The sharp, splintering crack of the doorframe was the first sound the house had made all night, a violent answer to their desperate questions. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness inside, illuminating dancing dust motes and old furniture covered in sheets. There was the faint, musty smell of a home that had been closed up for a long time. But there was nothing else. No sign of a struggle, no dropped candy, no small white sheet on the floor. There was no sign that the boy had ever been there at all. Brian was never seen again. The police investigation provided no answers, the case eventually growing cold and closing. The neighbors, once so vibrant, were never the same. They stopped having parties on their lawn. Then they stopped sitting on their porch. The joy in their eyes was replaced by a hollow, vacant look that never left. Their happiness seemed to crumble apart, year by year, until they were just two figures frozen in a grief that had no closure. Eventually, the dark house on the corner was sold. A nice couple moved in. They renovated it, painting the gloomy exterior a cheerful yellow. They had 3 young daughters, a nice Catholic family completely unaware of the event that had stained their home. They put up Christmas lights in December and held backyard barbecues in the summer, their happy, normal lives unfolding on top of an unspoken tragedy. But, for those who were there that night, the house was a scar. A strange, unnatural quiet settled over the entire street, an absence where the cheerful noise of children should have been. Years later, those who grew up on that block would still see the boys' parents sitting on their porch in the evenings, their once vibrant lives having simply, quietly, unraveled. They were a constant, silent reminder that the most terrifying things don't always announce themselves with a scream. Sometimes they just vanish, leaving nothing behind but an empty space and a silence you can hear for the rest of your life. The Halloween night began with a perfect, crisp autumn air. A gentle river of costumed children flowed from one house to the next, their happy shouts echoing down the quiet street. Inside, Carl sat with a large bowl of candy and a warm mug of cocoa, enjoying the simple peace of the evening. The polite greetings from the kids and the knowing waves from parents on the sidewalk painted a scene of simple, normal life. It was a good night. By 9 o'clock, the river of trick-or-treaters had slowed to a trickle and then stopped. Carl felt a pleasant sense of satisfaction. He flicked off the porch light, a silent signal that the night was over, and took the empty candy bowl to the kitchen. The house settled into a comfortable silence. That's when he heard it. 3 firm knocks that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. He figured it was just one last late straggler. Not bothered. He grabbed a small handful of leftover candy and opened the door. Standing on his porch was a teenager in a Dracula costume. He wore a cheap black cape and a plastic shirt with a fake white collar. His face was painted a ghostly white, with dark, crude shadows around his eyes, as if a child had done it. But the eyes themselves were not childish. They were brown and empty, like deep, dark holes. The boy said nothing. He didn't say trick or treat. He simply held out his bag in a silent, unblinking demand. The quiet was not shy. It felt heavy and deliberate. Carl, thrown off by the strangeness, dropped the candy into the bag. He mumbled, "Happy Halloween," and watched the boy turn and walk away without a word, melting into the darkness. Carl went back to the kitchen, happy to have a quiet moment. He poured a glass of wine and began to clean up the night's small mess. Just as he was starting to relax, another set of knocks hit the door. He knew with a sinking feeling in his stomach who it was. He opened it to find the same Dracula kid, his bag held out again. Okay, Carl said, trying to sound cheerful. "One more, then I'm all done for the night." The kid remained completely silent. Carl dropped a much larger handful of candy into the bag and watched him turn and walk away, his cape flapping behind him. 20 minutes passed. The house was locked. The last of the candy was put away, and a deep, comfortable silence had returned. Carl was on the couch, sipping his wine, finally at peace. Then he heard the third knock. He felt the blood drain from his face. It was past 10 now. No one should be out. He peered through the peephole, and his heart went cold. It was him. The same vampire kid, standing alone on the porch. Carl took a breath and opened the door, his voice firm but polite. "I'm sorry, no more candy. I'm all out." The boy just stared, his empty eyes holding Carl's for a long, unsettling moment. Then he lowered his bag, turned, and walked away into the night. The front door clicked shut. The solid thump of the deadbolt sliding into place brought a wave of relief, but it was tainted with a deep feeling of wrongness. He went to the kitchen and was stopped by the soft hiss of running water. He was almost certain he had turned the faucet off, but he dismissed it. As he turned the handle, a draft of cold autumn air whispered past his ear. He looked over and saw the back door was slightly ajar. A sudden shock, cold and sharp, ran through him. His skin went cold, and he could taste the metallic tang of fear in his mouth. He slammed the door shut and locked it, the sound of the bolt echoing in the quiet kitchen. The dread that had been slowly building now felt like a physical weight. He walked to his small safe and took out his handgun. The house was completely silent now, but it was a different kind of silence. It was heavy, watchful. He moved through the downstairs, his ears straining for any sound over the frantic, muffled thump of his own pulse. The air itself felt colder, clinging to his skin and raising the hair on his arms. He checked every window, his eyes searching the deep shadows of the yard. That's when he heard it. A single floorboard groaned upstairs. He froze, listening. Just the house settling, he told himself. But then another sound came. It was the distinct sound of slow, creaky steps, like someone was taking their time, wanting to be heard. Terror finally broke through his control. He yelled, his voice thin and shaky. "I've got a gun! Get out of my house!" The only answer was silence, a deep, oppressive quiet that seemed to swallow his words. Then a new sound. Thud, thud, thud. A basketball came bouncing slowly down the stairs and rolled to a stop right at his feet. In an instant, his fear was replaced by pure, hot anger. This was a prank. A stupid, cruel prank. "All right, you little motherfucker," he muttered. He put the gun away. He was going to march up those stairs and give this kid a piece of his mind. His own footsteps creaked loudly as he climbed into the darkness of the second floor. The air up here was even colder. He moved toward his office and saw a faint glow from the doorway. His computer screen was on, its soft light pulsing in the dark room. The room was empty. He continued down the hall to the bathroom. He could hear it again. The soft, incessant hiss of running water from the faucet. He knew then, with absolute certainty, that he was not alone. His bedroom door stood open. His eyes were drawn to the small closet in the corner, its door also slightly ajar. He flipped on the light and pulled the closet door wide open. Nothing. Just his own clothes hanging in the sudden, bright light. He stood there for a full minute, shaking his head, trying to make sense of it all. That's when a loud, wet thud slammed against his bedroom window, right beside his head. The sound was so close, so violent it made him cry out. He spun toward the window and looked out into the night. He saw him, the vampire kid scrambling down from the second-story windowsill. The teenager landed on the soft grass below, looked up and grinned. He gave Carl a mocking middle finger and then bolted into the night. A profound wave of relief washed over Carl. It was just an asshole kid. It was over. He went downstairs, his body weak with adrenaline, and poured another glass of wine. He sat down, his heart finally starting to slow. He looked toward the front door, the door he had locked and bolted himself. On the entryway floor was a single, fresh, muddy footprint. He followed it with his eyes to the door itself, which was now standing slightly ajar. And in that open doorway stood a second vampire kid. The kid saw him, his eyes wide, and then he turned and ran into the darkness, in the opposite direction from the first. Carl's wine glass slipped from his hand, the sound of it shattering lost in the sudden, roaring silence in his head. There were two of them, or maybe more. The rest of the night, he sat paralyzed by one single, repeating thought. Who was in his house, and who was coming back? He has never looked at his home the same way again. He has deadbolts now, and stronger windows and alarms. He spends his nights scrolling through security footage on his phone, watching the shadows. And every time the air conditioner kicks on or the water softener makes a sound in the night, he freezes, his heart pounding, absolutely convinced that someone is in his home. Jamie and his family arrived in the small Louisiana town as the first hints of autumn began to touch the air. The long drive had been a blur of highways and cramped motel rooms, and the sight of their new home, a two-story Victorian with a wide wraparound porch, felt like the finish line of a marathon. The air was different here, thick with the smell of damp earth and sweet magnolia, a stark contrast to the exhaust fumes of the city. As a software engineer used to the relentless pace of Silicon Valley, Jamie was chasing a quiet life, a place where his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, could have a classic small-town childhood. With Halloween just around the corner, an event Lily had been excitedly chattering about for months, it felt like the perfect time to start fresh. Their new house was full of character, from the way the old floorboards groaned to the soft, dusty light that filtered through the wavy glass of the original windows. As they explored the rooms, their voices echoing in the empty space, they felt a shared sense of profound relief. This was it, the escape they had dreamed of. The town's welcome was immediate. The most welcoming was their neighbor, Mr. Henderson, a man with a kind smile who seemed to be a pillar of the community. He appeared on their lawn the first day, his hands already dirty from his own garden. "Welcome, folks," he'd said, his voice warm. "We're so glad to have you. Anything you need, you just give a holler." He brought them a still warm pecan pie and later helped Jamie wrestle a rusty old lawnmower into submission. His questions felt like simple, small-town curiosity at the time. He asked about their jobs, their family history, where their parents were from. "It's always nice to know your neighbor's roots," he'd said with a disarming chuckle. The first few weeks were an idyllic dream. Sarah started a garden, her hands happily covered in dark, rich soil. Jamie set up his home office in a spare bedroom, overlooking the quiet, oak-lined street, the gentle pace of the town a soothing balm on his frayed nerves. They spent a whole Saturday carving pumpkins they'd bought from a local farm stand, the scent of cinnamon and pumpkin guts filling their new kitchen. Lily spent her afternoons on the porch swing, drawing endless pictures of herself in the astronaut costume she planned to wear for Halloween. They were happy, completely and utterly, cocooned in the town's warm, festive embrace. The first hint of something being off was a single off-key note in an otherwise perfect melody. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Jamie was watching Lily play in the front yard. He saw a kid, maybe 10 years old, standing at the edge of their property where the lawn met the dark woods. The kid was wearing a big plastic horsehead mask. It wasn't a cheap Halloween costume. It was made of a thick, rigid plastic, its painted-on smile wide and disturbingly fixed. The eyes were just vacant black holes. Jamie, still full of the town's good cheer, gave a friendly wave. The horse-headed kid didn't move. It just stood there, perfectly still. Jamie felt a flicker of unease, a primal sense of being watched that he hadn't felt since living in the city. He shook it off. "It's almost Halloween," he told himself. "People get weird. It's not the city. Let it go." After a long moment, the kid turned with a slow, deliberate motion and walked back into the woods. As Halloween drew closer, a strange shift occurred. The cheerful, store-bought decorations on their neighbors' houses, the smiling ghosts and friendly witches, began to disappear. They were replaced by bundles of corn husks tied to streetlights and strange rustic symbols painted on mailboxes. And they started seeing more of the horseheads. One afternoon at the park, they saw a group of them. They didn't laugh or shout. They moved with an odd, almost choreographed grace, taking strange, trotting steps, their plastic hooves making a dry, clicking sound on the pavement. The happy sounds of a normal playground were absent, replaced by an eerie, watchful silence. "That's not right, Jamie," Sarah whispered, pulling Lily a little closer. "They don't even talk." When Jamie mentioned the masks to Mr. Henderson, the neighbor's friendly smile didn't waver, but his eyes were sharp, analytical. "It's all part of our fall festival," he said, his gaze fixed on Jamie's reaction. "A long-standing local tradition. We believe it shows a strong community spirit when everyone participates." The words, meant to be reassuring, felt like a veiled instruction. The week before Halloween, the fall festival began in earnest, and it was clear Jamie's family was being watched. The masked townspeople would fall silent as they passed, their plastic horse heads turning in unison. The feeling of being welcomed had been replaced by a feeling of being constantly evaluated. Lily, in her astronaut helmet, was met with stony silence from the other children. One of them whispered the word "outsider" before trotting away. They were failing the test, though they didn't yet know they were being graded. On Halloween night, the test reached its climax. At each house, 2 candy bowls were presented. The horse-headed children received handfuls of the best candy. Lily, in her astronaut suit, was offered the other, smaller bowl, from which she received a single cheap lollipop. Her initial excitement faded into a quiet hurt. For Jamie, watching this deliberate exclusion was a slow, burning torture. Across the street, he saw Mr. Henderson watching them, his expression one of calm, clinical assessment. The friendliness was gone, replaced by a cold, silent judgment. They had failed. That night, Jamie called his old friend Alex, a data mining genius from his Silicon Valley days. An hour later, Alex called back. "You need to leave," he said, his voice grim. "I found the town's original charter from the 1920s. It's basically a eugenics manifesto. It talks about community purity, preserving heritage, and creating a perfected society. The founders were obsessed with creating a master race. Blonde hair, blue eyes, that whole horrifying deal." Alex continued, "I cross-referenced property records going back 50 years. Every family that has successfully stayed in that town fits a very specific demographic profile. The ones who didn't, they all sold their homes for a loss and left right after Halloween. You guys were never being welcomed. You were being vetted." The truth crashed down on Jamie. It was all a test. Mr. Henderson's questions, the masks, the festival. It was a series of trials designed to gauge their willingness to conform to the town's twisted ideals. When they showed confusion instead of acceptance, they failed. The escalating psychological pressure was the town's way of forcing out the impure. The kindness had been the bait, and the festival was the final exam. He looked at Sarah, who had been listening on speaker, her face a pale mask of horror. She was already on her feet, pulling a suitcase from the closet. Their previous home had been a fully furnished apartment, so the house was still sparse, easy to walk away from. They grabbed their daughter from her bed, their bags, and a few essentials. They got in the truck and drove, leaving behind the house they had believed would be their forever home. As they passed the town line, Jamie saw a figure standing at the side of the road. It was an old man in a tattered horsehead mask. He wasn't trotting. He was just standing there watching them go. At his feet was a single jack-o'-lantern, its face a simple hollowed-out hole, as vacant and soulless as the mask itself. In his hand, the man held a single plastic horse hoof, and he knocked it slowly, deliberately, against the wooden welcome sign. A hollow, echoing sound like a final, silent dismissal. A monster of a house stood at the end of a long driveway, a giant new build with too many windows and more rooms than any family could ever need. Music hammered from inside, its bass vibrating through the driveway pavement. Sounds of 100 conversations spilled out from an open front door, mixing with a sharp smell of spilled beer and fallen autumn leaves. Inside, it was even louder. A dense crowd of costumes and sweating bodies moved under spinning party lights. Jessica, dressed as a clunky Frankenstein, had already had a few drinks and was feeling a warm, easy buzz. Her friend Kyle was supposed to be her ride home. He was somewhere in the chaos, dressed in a simple black skeleton onesie. They were a funny pair. For the first hour, everything was fine. Jessica got separated from Kyle almost immediately, swallowed up by a sea of people. She navigated her way to the kitchen, grabbed another plastic cup of cheap beer, and just enjoyed the energy of the party. It was a good night. A little while later, she spotted him. Kyle was leaning against the kitchen island, wearing the same black skeleton onesie, a dark cup in his hand. He didn't look at her when she walked up, just gave a single slow nod. He gestured smoothly with his free hand toward a 2-liter bottle of soda on the counter. She poured some into her cup, and when she turned to thank him, he was already gone, lost back in the crowd. Night wore on. Music seemed to get louder, its bass a constant physical presence that you could feel in your teeth. Jessica saw him several more times. Once he was standing at an edge of the living room, perfectly still, just watching the dancers. Another time he was in a hallway, leaning against a wall, holding that same dark cup. He never waved. He never smiled. When she caught his eye, he would just stare back, his face blank under dim lights. She tried to walk over to him once, but by the time she pushed through people, he wasn't there. It was weird, but she figured he was just drunker than he'd let on. She shrugged it off and went back to the party. Fun started to fade after what felt like hours. Beer was making her tired, and her feet hurt. It was time to go home. She started her search, scanning a thinning crowd for that familiar black skeleton onesie. She finally found him near a back door. His shoulders slumped as he stared out the glass into a dark backyard. She walked up and tapped his shoulder. He turned around, and for a second his eyes looked completely empty under the party lights. She didn't think anything of it. She just pointed toward the front of the house. "Ready to go?" she asked. He gave that same slow nod, then pointed a finger toward the street and started walking. He didn't wait for her. Night air felt cold and clean after the stuffy heat of the party. Their walk was quiet. Only one sound broke the silence, the crunch of their shoes on dry leaves scattered across the sidewalk, a scraping sound that seemed to echo in the quiet. Jessica, feeling happy and drunk, didn't seem to notice his silence. She chattered on about her plans to make a hot pocket and put crushed Oreos on top of it when she got home. She leaned her head on his shoulder as they walked, completely at ease, just happy to be heading home with her friend. They reached her house, a dark shape at the end of the street. He walked her right up to her front door and stopped, turning to face her. He held out his arms for a hug. She leaned in and wrapped her arms around him. His body was stiff and strangely cold, like he had been standing outside for hours. He didn't hug her back. She pulled away and gave him a small, tired smile. He didn't smile back. He just turned, opened her front door for her, and then her world went black. Jessica woke up to a sound. A loud, rhythmic pounding seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. Sunlight stabbed at her eyes through the living room window. Her head throbbed with a dull, heavy pain. She was on her couch. Pounding came again, and she realized it was her front door. She pushed herself up, her whole body aching, and stumbled across the room. She pulled the door open and squinted. It was Kyle, real Kyle, holding a coffee and a box of donuts. He was wearing jeans and a hoodie, not a skeleton onesie. His face was a mix of confusion and relief. "Where did you go last night?" he asked, his voice tight with worry. "I looked everywhere for you." Jessica's blood ran cold. Her tired brain couldn't make sense of it. She pointed a shaky finger from him, back to herself. "You walked me home," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. Kyle's brow furrowed. He shook his head slowly, a clear no. He pulled his phone out of his pocket and showed her the screen. He had her contact page open. He pointed to a list of recent calls. There was nothing. He had tried calling her a dozen times after he couldn't find her at the party. No answer. Jessica stared at his phone, then back at his worried face, a sudden, sharp panic cutting through her hangover. Her keys. Her hands slapped against her pockets, searching frantically. They were gone. Her eyes shot down to the floor where the muddy footprints gave their silent testimony. A total stranger had walked her home, hugged her, and brought her inside. And now, somewhere out there, that stranger had her keys, to her car, and to her house. She had no idea who he was and no way of knowing if he was planning to stalk her, to watch her, or to one day come back. It was a rare Halloween, the kind that feels like it belongs in a storybook. A fine, thin powder of snow had fallen, a quiet sugar dusting that coated the sidewalks and clung to the orange glow of the streetlights. The whole neighborhood was alive, not with a single party, but with a sprawling, joyful environment of celebration. Laughter from kids and parents echoed from every direction, punctuated by a chorus of cheerful trick-or-treats. The air itself smelled like a perfect autumn memory, a mix of chocolate, sugar, and the clean, sharp bite of the first cold snap. Zachary was in the middle of it all. He was in 8th grade, an age where he felt old enough to navigate the familiar streets on his own. His parents agreed, but his neighbor, Mr. Abernathy, had gently insisted on coming along. Mr. Abernathy was a fixture in the neighborhood, a quiet old man with a long, slow stride and a smile that seemed permanently etched on his face. He was a good neighbor, the kind who always had a friendly word and made you feel that the world was a steady, predictable place. To have him along felt like an extra layer of safety, a symbol of innocence and comfort, walking beside him in the festive dark. For an hour, they moved through the happy, noisy crowds. The crunch of fresh snow under their boots was a constant rhythmic sound. Mr. Abernathy's cane tapped softly on the ground, a third beat in their simple rhythm. As they went from house to house, the old man pointed out different landmarks, giving Zachary little history lessons about the streets he thought he knew so well. He talked about running track right here, back when a Catholic high school with a cinder track stood where the grocery store now sat. He spoke of his 20 years in the military and his long, quiet career at the local library that followed. It was calm, gentle talk, the kind of conversation that grounds a person and makes the world feel safe and solid. They were just a few minutes from home, turning down a less crowded side street where the sounds of the neighborhood began to fade into a pleasant background hum. Mr. Abernathy had just finished a story about his time stationed in Germany. He was walking just as he had been all night, his posture unchanged, his pace steady. He didn't miss a beat, looking straight ahead as he continued his thought, his voice the same calm murmur it had been all evening. "After the military, I worked at the public library for 20-some years," he said, the words flowing as easily as any of his other stories. "I liked it, but the manager, he was a hard man. He made me feel like I was a ghost." He paused, and in the space between his words, The distant sounds of Halloween seemed to dim. He took a long, slow breath, a sound that seemed to have a physical weight to it, pressing down on Zachary's shoulders. He would say I was just an old vet who was in his way. Made me feel like I was being slowly suffocated. Mr. Abernathy continued to speak, his voice never changing pitch, never betraying a single flicker of anger or sadness. He described with simple clarity how the man's casual cruelty had eaten away at him, day after day. Zachary kept walking beside him, his own feet suddenly feeling heavy and strange. He was frozen, not by fear, but by a deep and chilling confusion. The man beside him, the one who smelled faintly of old paper and wintergreen, was talking about something far darker than history lessons. He was having such a good time just a moment ago, and his brain couldn't quite catch up. He didn't believe it, couldn't believe it. This was Mr. Abernathy, the kind old man he'd known for years. Then Mr. Abernathy's eyes met Zachary's. They were still distant, still devoid of any discernible emotion, but the sudden shift to direct eye contact sent a jolt through the boy's entire body. The old man's voice dropped to a gentle whisper, a soft exhalation on the cold air that carried words that would follow Zachary home for the rest of his life. "I killed him," he said. The words landed in the air and created a new kind of silence. The distant, happy noises of the neighborhood were still there, but they were a world away now. In the vacuum left by those two words, the only sound was the faint crunch of their boots in the snow. "I poisoned his lunch," Mr. Abernathy went on, his gaze returning to the path ahead. "When he got sick, I stayed behind to finish the shift. Once it got dark, I took his body, wrapped it in a tarp, and drove down to the local river. I threw him in and watched him sink." He spoke with no shame, no guilt. The act was just another fact of his life, a story he was telling, just like his time in the army or his job at the library. He said he just wanted to confess it before he died, as he knew he didn't have much time left. Zachary walked the rest of the way home in a state of stunned, hollow shock. He was completely zoned in, hyper-aware of everything and yet unable to process any of it. The snow-covered streets, which had looked so beautiful just minutes before, now seemed grotesque and menacing. The warm glow of jack-o'-lanterns no longer looked cheerful. They were mocking, leering eyes. The distant shouts of "trick or treat," no longer joyful. They were just background noise, a terrible, meaningless secret being yelled into the wind. The candy in his bag felt like lead. He kept his eyes on the ground, unable to look at the man walking beside him. Mr. Abernathy was still calm, his pace unchanged, the tap of his cane just as normal as it had been all night. He had a strange, contented look on his face now. Zachary felt a deep, profound unease, not because he felt he was in danger, but because of how little had changed. The kind man he knew was still there, but so was the murderer. The two had simply merged into one, an unanswerable walking question. As they reached Mr. Abernathy's driveway, the old man stopped. His purpose fulfilled, he turned to Zachary and offered a final wave. It was a friendly gesture, the simple wave of a kind neighbor on a snowy Halloween night. But Zachary knew better. He knew it was the wave of a ghost. He gave a short, numb nod in return and walked into his own home, the weight of the old man's story a cold, heavy presence that the warmth of the house could not touch. It would be a week before he told the police, a week in which the confession echoed in every quiet moment, long after the old man had already died. Halloween night in 2024 felt wrong inside the Indianapolis Walmart. It was 4 a.m., and a deep quiet had settled over everything. Serena Vance, a stalker, had gotten there early for her shift. She clocked in, the machine's punchy sound echoing in the empty entrance. She was used to the store being silent at this hour, but this was different. This was a heavy, watching kind of quiet. The buzzing from the overhead fluorescent lights seemed to drill right into her ears. They cast long, sharp shadows down every aisle, making the familiar place feel alien. Serena had been doing this job for years. She knew the sound of the pallet jack's wheels on the concrete, the specific groan of the freezer section's coolers, the exact spot where a tile was loose near the dairy case. This place was predictable, but on this night that predictability was gone. Her task was simple: head to the back and check on a late shipment of Halloween candy that needed to be put out. She started her walk, her steel-toed boots making a lonely scuffing sound on the polished floor. The journey took her through the main artery of the supercenter, a massive, cavernous space that felt more like an empty warehouse than a store. She passed the electronics department first. A wall of black television screens stared back at her like dead eyes. A flicker of movement in one of them was just her own reflection, but it made her jump. She pushed on, her pace a little faster now. Next was the clothing section, filled with rows of faceless mannequins standing in unnatural poses. In the strange light, they looked like a frozen crowd, all watching her pass. It was just a feeling, but it was a strong one. That's when she heard it. A low, rhythmic clicking sound coming from the toy aisle to her left. It wasn't the sound of a machine. It was smaller, sharper, deliberate, like a wind-up toy someone had left on, clicking its way across a shelf. Serena stopped dead, listening. The clicking continued for a few seconds, then stopped as suddenly as it began. She stood perfectly still, waiting for it to start again. The only sound was the loud buzz of the lights overhead. She thought about walking down the aisle to check it out, but something held her back. She told herself it was nothing, just the date, the spooky season getting into her head. She kept moving, picking up her pace again. The feeling of being watched was no longer just a prickle on her neck. It was a certainty. She felt like there were eyes on her from the dark spaces between the towering shelves. She glanced down a long aisle piled high with canned goods and thought she saw a shadow at the far end move. It was there 1 second, gone the next. She froze, staring into the darkness, but there was nothing. She tried to reason it away. It was just the lights playing tricks, just her tired mind. But her gut was screaming at her that something was wrong. She knew, with a certainty she couldn't explain, that she was not alone in the store. Her walk felt longer than usual. Every little sound made her flinch, the distant hum of a cooler kicking on, the settling groan of the building itself. These were normal sounds she'd heard 1,000 times, but tonight they sounded like threats. This wasn't the peaceful quiet of an empty building. It was the tense, waiting silence of a trap. She was almost to the seasonal section, almost to her destination. She just wanted to get her work done and count the minutes until the other employees started showing up. The true horror didn't build from there. It simply happened, with a speed and brutality that her mind could barely process. Serena turned the corner into the seasonal aisle, her eyes scanning the shelves for the candy shipment. That's when a figure stepped out from behind a tall display of costume boxes. He was wearing a dark, nondescript hoodie, his face completely lost in the shadow it cast. Before she could scream, before she could even take a step back, another one appeared from behind a large bin of candy. They had her boxed in. 1,000 questions flashed through her mind. Who were they? How did they get in? The doors should have been locked and secured. There was no way in unless you had a key. They moved together, silently, and with a chilling coordination. They didn't speak. They didn't demand money. They weren't there to rob the place. A hand grabbed her hair from behind, yanking her head back with incredible force. The other figure moved in, and the first punch landed. The only sounds in the entire vast store were the dull, wet thuds of the blows, Serena's own choked gasps for air, and one other small, sharp sound. A tiny metallic click. It was a sound she knew well, a sound the whole world knew. It was the sound of a phone starting to record a video. They were filming it. That realization was a horror colder and deeper than the physical pain. They were making content. They held their phones up, angling them to get the right shot, turning her terror and her pain into a show for some unseen, online audience. It was casual. It was dehumanizing. It was over as fast as it started. They lowered their phones, turned and simply jogged away, their footsteps quickly fading into the store's deep silence. They left Serena crumpled on the cold floor. For a few long moments, all she could hear was the ringing in her ears and the same steady buzzing of the indifferent fluorescent lights. Eventually, the silence was shattered by the flashing of red and blue lights against the front windows and the loud, jarring crackle of police radios. The officers' voices echoed strangely in the huge space as they walked the aisles. Their questions seemed pointless, absurd. Did she recognize them? Did they say anything? Did they take anything? She just shook her head, unable to explain the one thing she knew for sure. They weren't there for any of the normal reasons. The only thing the attackers left behind was the video. It showed up online, a short, brutal clip that local news stations reported on. An anonymous assault on a stalker in an empty store. But the reports offered no answers. The attackers were ghosts, shadows who had appeared from nowhere and vanished just as completely, leaving only digital proof of their cruelty. And that's the part that never leaves. The bruises healed, but the questions are permanent. The attackers were never identified. Their reasons were never known. They weren't criminals looking for money or revenge. They were a new kind of evil, one that hunts for clicks and views. They turned a boring, everyday job into a horror story. The real lasting fear from that night wasn't just the memory of the attack. It was the knowledge that some people do terrible things for no reason at all, and that safety is never guaranteed, not even in the places you know best. The job was simple. Keep the floors of the Walmart superstore in Florida looking new. For Garrett, working the overnight shift on Halloween was usually a bonus, holiday pay and zero trick-or-treaters. The last manager, wearing a cheap vampire cape over his polo shirt, had locked the doors around 11. After that, the whole massive place was his. The air inside was cool and smelled like floor wax, mixed with the sugary scent of candy corn and cheap chocolate from the decimated seasonal aisle. It was quiet, but never completely silent. There was always the low, steady drone from the wall of coolers and freezers, a constant background noise you learned to ignore. He started his shift like any other, working his way from the back stockrooms toward the front entrance with the industrial floor buffer. It was heavy work, guiding the machine back and forth, turning the dull, scuffed tiles into a reflective shine. He had his headphones on, listening to a podcast, completely in his own world. The only things moving in the store were him, the machine, and the long dancing shadows cast by the aisle displays. Plastic skeletons and grinning jack-o'-lanterns, left over from the day's chaos, seemed to watch him as he worked. He was in the main grocery aisle when he first felt it, a deep rumble that came up through the concrete floor, strong enough to feel through the soles of his boots. He stopped the buffer and pulled off his headphones. The drone of the coolers was all he heard for a second. Then the rumble came again, louder this time. It sounded like a big diesel truck, the kind that makes the windows shake when it passes your house. But this wasn't the road. This was the store's parking lot. And the sound was getting closer, not farther away. He figured it was just a late delivery truck. He shook his head and was about to put his headphones back on when the sound changed. It became a high-pitched, grinding roar. It was the sound of heavy machinery being pushed way too hard, and it was aimed directly at the front of the store. Then came the crash. It wasn't just breaking glass. It was a full-throated, violent explosion of sound that shook the entire building. The metal security gate over the entrance screamed as it was torn from its moorings. A tidal wave of shattering plate glass and twisting metal followed, a sound so loud it felt like a physical blow. Garrett stood there, frozen, 200 feet away in the canned vegetable aisle. A cloud of dust and debris billowed down the main thoroughfare. The air filled with the smell of destruction, concrete dust, hot metal, and something like ozone. For a few seconds, there was just the sound of things settling. A final piece of the ceiling clattered to the floor. Then, the grinding mechanical roar started up again. He saw it then, moving slowly through the haze. A huge orange excavator, the kind you see on highway construction sites, was inside the store. It looked like some grotesque Halloween prop brought to life. Its massive steel bucket was raised high, and as Garrett watched, the operator swung the arm and smashed it sideways into the checkout counters. Registers, conveyor belts, and candy racks were flattened into a heap of scrap metal. His training, the little videos they make you watch when you get hired, said to evacuate in an emergency. But his body wouldn't listen. His legs were locked in place. He watched as the machine plowed forward, its tracks crunching over the wreckage, turning right down the aisle for health and beauty products. Shelves toppled like dominoes, sending a shower of shampoo bottles and makeup across the floor. It carved a path of destruction, crushing cardboard haunted houses and snapping plastic scythes under its weight. The machine was a monster, and it was just getting started. Finally, the engine sputtered and died. The sudden quiet was heavy, broken only by the steady drip of some leaking fluid from the ruined machine. The cab door squeaked open, and a man climbed out. He was just a regular guy, not big or imposing, wearing a t-shirt and jeans. He wasn't wearing a mask. In his hand, he held a machete. It wasn't a plastic prop. He held it like he knew how to use it. That's what broke the spell. Garrett turned and ran, his boots slipping on the polished floor. He dove behind a long, sturdy aisle of canned goods, pressing his back against the cold steel shelves. He tried to control his breathing, making himself as small as possible. The man started yelling. It wasn't words, just raw, angry noise that echoed off the high ceilings. It was the sound of pure, pointless rage. Garrett could hear the man walking. The crunch of his boots on the broken glass and debris got closer. This wasn't a robbery. A robber would be quiet. A robber would have a goal. This was something else entirely. Something much worse. The man walked past the end of Garrett's aisle, and for a terrifying second, Garrett could see him clearly. He was just swinging the machete wildly, hacking at displays. He took the head off a werewolf cutout with a single clean swing. He wasn't looking for anything, he was just destroying. Garrett fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. He managed to dial 911. When the operator answered, he could barely get the words out, whispering his location, praying the man couldn't hear his voice. He stayed on the line, phone pressed hard against his ear, listening to the man continue his rampage on the other side of the store. He heard the man find the electronics section. The sound of him smashing television screens with the flat of the machete was sickening. A series of dull, percussive pops. It felt like an hour, but it was probably only 5 minutes before he heard the sirens. They started as a faint cry in the distance and grew steadily louder until they were right outside, their flashing lights strobing through the shattered entrance, illuminating the carnage in pulses of red and blue. The man with the machete heard them too. His yelling got louder, more frantic. Garrett stayed put, listening to the new sounds. He heard police officers shouting commands, their voices sharp and clear. "Drop the weapon! Get on the ground!" The man just screamed back at them, a final defiant roar on a ruined Halloween night. There was a series of loud bangs, which Garrett later learned was the sound of beanbag rounds being fired. There was the sharp crack of a taser, a struggle, more shouting, and then, finally, quiet. A different kind of quiet. It was the sound of the aftermath, of the situation being over. Garrett didn't move until he heard an officer's voice call out, "Is anyone else in here?" They rebuilt the store's entrance and eventually restocked all the shelves. The police reports were filed, and the man was sent away. The official story was that an unstable person committed a violent act, but that was just a label people used to make it fit in a box. What stayed with Garrett wasn't the memory of the machine or the blade. It was the simple, clean fact of the event itself. It was the knowledge that the world contains people who will just decide to tear a hole in a normal Tuesday night, and that sometimes there is nothing that comes after. There is no discovery, no hidden truth. There is only the destruction they leave behind. The time clock punched out a receipt that read 11:47 p.m. Outside, the parking lot was dead empty, but inside the Southfield Walmart, the workday was just getting started. This was Joe's office, a massive, echoing warehouse of a place where the only other living things were the goldfish swimming in their tanks back in the pet aisle. He liked the quiet. It was predictable. Joe's job was light work. Keep the shelves stocked and the place in order for the morning crew. He knew the building's noises like he knew the back of his hand. The steady drone of the open-faced coolers in the dairy section. The high-pitched squeak of the front left wheel on his stocking cart. The loud clank the security gate made every hour as it settled. For years, these were the only sounds he heard, and they were a comfort. But this was October. The corporate office had sent down boxes of Halloween junk. Fake spider webs made of cheap cotton were stretched over the apples. Cardboard skeletons with goofy grins hung from the ceiling lights. In the seasonal aisle, a row of motion-activated ghouls and monsters stood silent, their batteries not yet pulled. They weren't scary. They were just plastic, waiting for a customer that wouldn't be there for another 8 hours. He'd just finished the soup aisle when he heard it. A distinct, solid click from a storage room in the back of the store. He stopped his cart, the squeaky wheel falling silent. He was certain he'd left that door propped open. He walked the long aisle back to check. The door was closed tight. He figured the building's air conditioning must have pulled it shut. He shook his head and got back to work. A little while later, one of the fluorescent lights directly above him began to flicker, making a sound like a bug zapper. Bzzz, bzzz, bzzz. He looked up and it stopped, glowing steady like all the others. Bad ballast, he thought. Old building. But a weird feeling started to set in. The feeling of being the only person in a very, very big room. That feeling got a lot worse when he went back to the employee office for his break. Sitting directly on his keyboard was a folded piece of paper. It wasn't company letterhead. It was cheap, lined paper torn from a spiral notebook. His hands felt cold as he picked it up. Inside, written in messy block letters, were 4 words. "I know you're here." He immediately broke protocol, locked himself in the office, and called the police. 2 officers showed up 20 minutes later. They walked the store with him, flashlights cutting through the dark aisles. They found nothing. No broken locks, no open windows. They took the note, but their questions made it clear what they thought. "You sure one of the day guys isn't just messing with you?" one of them asked. They filed a police report for a nuisance complaint and left. Joe was alone again, but the store no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. The next few nights were a masterclass in psychological torture. The person playing this game was careful. Joe would come back to an aisle to find an entire row of cereal boxes turned perfectly backward. He'd find a single child's tricycle parked in the middle of the main walkway, facing him, as if waiting for a rider. He called the police a second time, but over the phone, the dispatcher told him that without a direct threat or evidence of a break-in, there was nothing they could do. He was on his own. 1 week after the first note, Joe decided he needed proof. He propped his cell phone up on a high shelf in the main aisle, hidden between 2 large boxes of laundry detergent, and hit record. An hour later, he retrieved the phone and locked himself in the bathroom to watch the footage. He fast-forwarded through long stretches of nothing. Then, he saw it. A figure stepped out from behind a pillar 2 aisles down. They were wearing a dark hoodie and a cheap plastic clown mask. The person was huge, at least 6'5", with the lean, powerful build of a basketball player. The figure looked directly toward the camera for a long moment before slipping back into the shadows. Joe's hands were shaking. He was in his early 40s, 5'8", and carrying 220 pounds he knew he should have lost years ago. He was no fighter, and he had no weapons. He was on the phone with 911, whispering his location, when he saw him again, standing stock still at the far end of the main aisle. Before Joe could even finish his sentence to the dispatcher, the towering figure broke into a dead sprint. He wasn't running at Joe, but past him. The stalker moved with terrifying speed, a blur of dark clothing and a grinning clown mask that shot past Joe's aisle, the wind from his movement rustling the chip bags on a nearby display. The sheer shock and surprise of it sent a jolt through Joe's system. He stumbled backward, his legs giving out, and he fell hard onto the cold, polished floor. By the time he looked up, the figure was gone. For 10 minutes there was nothing but the sound of Joe's own ragged breathing. He picked himself up, his body aching, and began cautiously moving toward the front of the store, his eyes scanning every shadow. He passed a large promotional wire cage full of colorful plastic balls for kids. As he drew level with it, the clown figure exploded out from behind the cage. "Boo!" The shout was so loud it was like a physical blow. Joe yelled and fell back again, scrambling away on his hands and feet. The clown didn't pursue. He just stood there for a second before sprinting off again, vanishing into the labyrinth of shelves. Joe knew he was being played with. This was a game, and he was the mouse. He was completely broken, no longer even trying to be quiet, just focused on getting to the front doors. He was halfway there when a voice hissed directly behind his ear. He hadn't heard a thing. "Freddy's going to get ya!" Joe screamed a raw, panicked sound and spun around to see the clown standing right there, its painted smile inches from his face. The figure let out a horrible, cackling laugh, then turned. He didn't sprint this time. He just casually jogged away, pushing through the front doors and disappearing into the night, just as the first police car arrived. The police swarmed the building, but the clown was long gone. The detective who took his statement confirmed what Joe already knew in his gut. This wasn't personal. Reports from a town 60 miles away described the same routine, the same game. The person who did this was never caught. That's the part that sticks with Joe. It wasn't a ghost. It was a real person, a 6'5" athlete who, for fun, found a man who was alone, out of shape, and helpless, and decided to sadistically torture him. He's still out there, a shadow in a clown mask, looking for another cage and another slow turtle to play with. The year was 2020, the last week of October, Halloween night. The streetlights cast long shadows down the empty sidewalks. Most folks were already inside, the excitement of the holiday over. Inside his house, a politician, a man we will call Croft to protect his identity, was finally getting a moment of quiet. At 79 years old, the chaos of the holiday was a welcome but tiring event. The glow from a carved pumpkin on his porch flickered across the living room, the last bit of festive light in a house that was settling into silence. It was a perfectly normal end to a perfectly normal holiday. Then, a sound that didn't belong. A scuff, the sound of a shoe on the hardwood floor just behind him. Croft turned. The person standing there was a stranger, a solid shape in the dim light, and he was already inside. He stood with an unnatural stillness, his eyes locked on Croft with a predator's unwavering focus. A cold feeling, the kind that has nothing to do with the temperature, washed over Croft. He pushed his chair back, the sound loud in the quiet room. As Croft moved back, the stranger moved forward. This wasn't a robbery. This was something else entirely. The intruder pulled out a handful of zip ties. Croft, even at 79, wasn't about to just let this happen. He tried to resist, but the intruder was a blur of manic strength. He got a couple of ties around Croft's wrists, pulling them tight, but it was a clumsy job. The intruder wasn't thinking clearly. The ties weren't fully secure. He was bound, but not helpless. Then the talking started. It was a rant, a torrent of twisted ideas that spilled out of him. The voice itself was unsettling, shifting from a low, gravelly monotone to a cracking, high-pitched scream with no warning. He paced the room, his voice echoing, talking about how Croft was part of some grand conspiracy. Croft stayed quiet, watching, feeling the plastic of the zip ties digging into his skin. He could feel a little give. It wasn't much, but it was something. In the middle of a screamed sentence, the intruder stopped dead. He stared at Croft, whose silence seemed to trigger something deep within the man's rage. He lunged forward without a word. Before Croft could react, the man's hands were around his throat, squeezing with an adrenaline-fueled strength. All the air left Croft's lungs. The room began to swim, the edges of his vision turning dark. He couldn't breathe, couldn't make a sound. The only thing he could hear was the intruder's ragged breathing, hot against his face. It was pure, explosive rage. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The hands were gone. The intruder stood up, turned his back, and went right back to pacing the room, continuing his frantic rant as if nothing had happened. Croft was left gasping, the sharp pain in his throat a brutal reminder that the line between psychological terror and lethal violence had just been erased. The intruder grabbed Croft by the arm and dragged him through the house. He pulled him toward the back, into the kitchen. And that's when Croft saw his chance. A small emergency alert button near the baseboard on the floor. The intruder had his back turned. Croft, pretending to stumble, dropped to one knee and pressed the button hard with his thumb. There was no sound. He had no idea if it worked. He got back to his feet. Now the waiting began. Had the signal gone through? The house was dead quiet, except for the intruder's muttering. Croft could hear the blood pounding in his own ears. Every second that dripped by without the sound of a siren felt like an hour. He decided he couldn't wait. With a surge of adrenaline, he twisted his hands hard. He felt the sharp snapping sound of the zip tie giving way. He was free. He lunged, tackling the intruder from the side. They crashed to the floor in a desperate, ugly struggle. Just then, the front door burst open. "Police!" The call had worked. Two officers stood in the entryway. The room was chaos. In that split second, the intruder reached for the crowbar he'd been carrying. Before the officers could cross the room, he swung it, striking Croft hard in the head. The impact was a sickening, solid thud, but it was his last act of violence. The officers were on him instantly, tackling him to the ground. The aftermath was a blur of paramedics and police. Croft survived. The intruder, however, would not be a free man again. The case went to trial in 2022. He was convicted on both federal and state charges. The judgment was severe and final. He received a 30-year sentence in federal prison, to be followed by a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole on the state charges, to be served at the same time. The legal system had provided its cold, factual postscript to a night of absolute terror, closing the book on the man who brought a real-world nightmare to Croft's door on Halloween. A quiet Connecticut suburb on Halloween night is its own kind of magic. In Darien, back in 2019, the air had that perfect autumn bite, and it carried the smell of dry leaves and wood smoke from distant chimneys. All up and down the streets, you could hear the happy, echoing noise of kids laughing, their costumes making soft, rustling sounds as they ran from one glowing porch light to the next. It was a postcard of affluent, safe American life. For Thomas and Catherine, this was the life they'd built, and nights like this were the reward. Their home, tucked away inside a gated community, felt like an impenetrable fortress. But tonight wasn't about the house, it was about their daughter, Lily. At 7 years old, dressed as a small astronaut, she was completely lost in the magic. Her shyness often made things like this a challenge, but tonight she was brave. At one house, an older woman with a kind smile waited patiently as Lily took a deep breath and managed a quiet trick or treat. The woman's face lit up, and she dropped a cascade of extra candy bars into Lily's plastic jack-o'-lantern bucket. The small victory made Lily beam for the rest of the block. Thomas and Catherine walked a few steps behind her, just watching. They saw neighbors on their porches waving. They saw groups of teenagers, surprisingly well-behaved, roaming the sidewalks. Everything was exactly as it should be. It was all so wonderfully normal, so completely predictable. This was their world, and in their world, they were safe. After they'd hit every house on their cul-de-sac, Lily looked up, her bucket heavy. "Can we go to the big houses now?" she asked, her voice full of hope. "The ones with the ghosts in the trees?" "You got it, astronaut," Thomas said, smiling. "Let's hit the jackpot." They walked back to their car, the mood light and easy. The first part of the drive was filled with Lily chattering in the back seat, examining her candy under the glow of the streetlights. They talked about which house had the best decorations and whether the giant inflatable spider was scarier than the smoke machine. There was nothing in the world but the three of them in their warm car, moving through a perfect autumn night. It was only after several minutes of driving, as they turned off the well-lit main road onto a darker, more secluded street, that the world outside the car began to feel different. The houses here were spread further apart, hidden behind long driveways and clusters of old trees. The sounds of other trick-or-treaters faded away. It was here in the deeper quiet that Thomas first noticed the headlights. A dark sedan, hanging back at a distance in his rearview mirror. He didn't think much of it at first, but when he made another turn, the headlights followed. Now it was no longer a coincidence. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. A cold, heavy feeling started to settle in. He didn't say anything to Catherine, But the mood in the car had shifted from easy contentment to a low, humming tension. He just kept driving, his eyes flicking from the road ahead to the mirror. He came to a stop sign at the end of the dark road. As his foot hit the brake, a second car, its headlights off, suddenly pulled out from a side street, blocking the intersection. They were trapped. The sedan behind them pulled up close, boxing them in. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. This was real. Before he could even think, a door from the car in front of them flew open. A figure dressed in black got out and walked toward them. The figure raised a handgun, pointing it directly at Thomas's face through the windshield. In the back seat, Lily let out a small, confused whimper. Time seemed to stop. The world shrunk down to just that dark figure and the barrel of the gun. At that exact moment, from the side of their own car came a sudden, violent pop. It was immediately followed by a loud, sustained hiss. Everything happened at once. The figure with the gun lowered it, turned, and got back into the car. Both vehicles sped off into the night, their tires screaming on the pavement. They were left alone in the middle of a dark intersection, in a car with a flat tire, shaking with adrenaline. Their first thought was just pure relief. They were alive. They thought they had survived a botched carjacking. They thought the worst was over. It took time to get help and talk to the police. By the time they finally pulled into their own driveway, the family was exhausted and rattled, but they felt like they had faced the danger and it had passed. They just wanted to go inside and lock their fortress doors. But the moment Thomas put the key in the front door, he knew. The door pushed open on its own. It was unlocked. And inside, there was only darkness. The power was out. A cold dread, far worse than what he felt with a gun in his face, washed over him. They stepped inside. The house was dead quiet. The air was stale and cold, and as their eyes adjusted, they saw the truth. The place was a wreck. Drawers were pulled out, belongings thrown around. In the study, a huge, gaping hole was torn in the wall. The massive 60-pound safe they had hidden there was gone. The horror finally clicked into place. The chase, the gun, the popped tire. It was all a show. A calculated professional distraction designed to keep them pinned down while a second team bled their house dry. These weren't amateurs. The cut power lines meant the security cameras were useless. A neighbor's security camera later showed two figures moving with chilling, fluid confidence. The stolen goods, valued at over $400,000, were never recovered. The suspects were never caught. In a final desperate act weeks later, the family offered a $20,000 reward for information. Nobody ever came forward. Not one person ever called. They were left to live in their violated home, their feeling of security shattered forever. The true horror of that Halloween night wasn't the gun. It was the chilling precision of the people who had selected them as a target and stolen the one thing they could never get back. This quiet of the house was something Danielle had earned. It was the prize at the end of a 10-hour shift of physical work, a deep silence that soaked into her aching muscles. The house itself was old, and it had its own language of noises she knew by heart. The low groan of the pipes in the walls, the click and sigh of the furnace kicking on in the basement. These were the sounds of safety, the familiar rhythm of a home settling in for the night. She'd fallen into bed an hour ago, and sleep had taken her quickly, pulling her down into a heavy, dreamless dark. It was the kind of complete shutdown her body demanded. Something pulled her back from the edge of that deep sleep. It wasn't a noise. It was a change. A subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The air on her face felt colder, and the familiar, gentle sounds of the house were gone. The furnace wasn't sighing. The pipes weren't groaning. There was only a flat, dead stillness that felt unnatural. She was hovering in that space between sleep and awareness, her body still heavy, but her senses beginning to prickle, telling her that some small, important rule of the night had been broken. That's when the sound came. It was soft, but it was all wrong. A dull, wet-sounding thud from the far corner of the room. It was an ugly, dense sound, like a heavy bag of wet laundry being dropped onto the carpet. Her tired brain immediately tried to explain it away. A book falling off the shelf, a branch tapping against the outside window. But it was too heavy for a book, and it had come from inside the room. The sound didn't repeat. It just hung there in the new, suffocating silence. Danielle's eyes opened to a darkness that was almost total. The only light was a pale, fuzzy rectangle on the floor, cast from the porch light outside her window. It wasn't enough to see by, only enough to turn the familiar shapes of her furniture into vague, hulking shadows. She lay perfectly still, straining to listen. Her breathing was a quiet catch in her throat. Her heart began a slow, heavy beat against her ribs, a deliberate, pounding rhythm that seemed to be the only thing moving in the world. Slowly, carefully, she pushed herself up on her elbows. Her gaze swept across the dark room, cataloging the shadows. The dresser, the closet door, the old, worn-out armchair in the corner. Her eyes stopped there. The shape was wrong. It was too big, too bulky. Her mind, practical and refusing to leap to conclusions, started its checklist. It's the coat she threw there after work. It's a pile of clothes for the wash tomorrow. She squinted, trying to force the shape to resolve into one of those harmless things. But the longer she looked, the more certain she became. A coat doesn't have that curve at the top. A pile of laundry doesn't have the distinct slump of shoulders. The realization didn't come in a rush. It was a slow, cold ooze of truth that seeped into her mind. The shape in the chair was a person. The air in the room became frigid, and a cold she couldn't explain began to creep up her limbs. An intruder was in her room, sitting just 10 feet from where she slept. The questions were simple, direct, and paralyzing. Who is it? How did they get in? She sat up fully, the bed springs making a low groan that seemed to shriek in the silence. The figure in the chair didn't react. Her voice, when she finally found it, was a dry, reedy whisper. Who are you? There was no answer, just a small, almost imperceptible movement from the chair, a shiver that shook the entire shape. It was a human motion, a response to cold or fear. Danielle's hand moved, shaking, toward the bedside lamp. Her instincts told her this was a terrible idea, that some things are better left unseen. But the need to know, to face whatever was there, was stronger. She flicked the switch. Light flooded the room, harsh and unforgiving. The scene it revealed was worse than any shadow. The person in the chair was a young woman, maybe 20, and she was soaked through. Water dripped from her dark hair onto the chair, pooling on the floor. Her clothes were plastered to her skin, streaked with mud and grass. Her face was pale, almost gray, with dark smudges of dirt. But it was her eyes that stole the air from Danielle's lungs. They were wide, fixed on nothing, and filled with a kind of blank, animal terror that went far beyond being caught in a stranger's house. This was the look of something that had been hunted. Danielle's first instinct wasn't to call the police. That could come later. The raw fear on the girl's face was a problem that needed a solution right now. She got out of bed, grabbing a thick towel from the closet and a blanket from the foot of her bed. She held them out. The girl didn't seem to see them at first. Then her eyes focused on Danielle, and her mouth opened. The first words came out, broken and chattering. "He was there in the woods. I ran." Bit by bit, the story came out. It was a simple, brutal nightmare. She'd been walking home on the old service road behind the neighborhood when a man had grabbed her. He dragged her from the road into the dark, wet woods that bordered the houses. She fought. She kicked and clawed and screamed, but no one was around to hear. In the struggle, she broke free and just ran. She didn't know which way she was going. She just ran from the sound of him behind her, crashing through branches, slipping in the mud, fueled by pure, desperate adrenaline. She thought she was lost for good. And then she saw it. Through the trees, a single point of yellow light. Danielle's porch light. She didn't know whose house it was. She just knew it was a sign of safety. It was the only thing in the world to run toward. She aimed for it, bursting out of the woods, stumbling across the backyard. The back door, she'd mumbled, was unlocked. Danielle never locked it. She'd collapsed into the first chair she found in the first room she entered, her body finally giving out. The police came. They took the girl's statement, their voices low and serious. An ambulance took her to the hospital. And then they were all gone. Danielle was left standing in her bedroom, the wet spot on the chair and the muddy footprints on the floor, the only proof that any of it had happened. The house was quiet again, but the silence was different now. It was thin, fragile. Every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of the window pane from the wind was a question. The realization settled on her, heavy and suffocating. The attacker had watched the girl run straight to her house. He knew where she lived. Sleep was impossible. But staying in the bedroom with the damp, empty armchair in the corner felt worse. She went to the living room and sank into the sofa, telling herself she would stand guard until sunrise. The adrenaline eventually faded, and the profound, bone-deep exhaustion of her workday pulled her under. She woke with a jolt, her neck stiff, to a room filled with the full, bright light of morning. For a moment, there was just confusion. Then the memory of the night returned. She looked around. Everything seemed normal. The house was quiet, but it was the familiar quiet of a weekday morning. The terror of the night felt distant, like a bad dream receding in the daylight. She pushed herself up, her joints aching, and walked on autopilot to the kitchen. She started a pot of coffee, the familiar gurgle of the machine a comforting sound. She was just a tired woman getting ready for another day. The night was over. She poured the hot black coffee into her favorite mug, the warmth a welcome feeling in her hands. She took a sip, leaning against the counter, letting the caffeine begin its work. Her house was safe. The sun was up. It was over. She took another drink of coffee, her eyes scanning the living room. She was about to turn back to the kitchen when she saw it. The front door. From this angle, she could see the deadbolt. The small metal knob was in the horizontal position. Unlocked. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, cut through the warmth of the coffee. She set the mug down on the counter with a loud clack. She walked slowly, deliberately, toward the door, her heart beginning to pound a hard, fast rhythm in her chest. She reached out a single trembling finger and pushed. The door swung inward without a sound, revealing the sunlit porch. It had been left unlatched. It had been open all night. She had been safe, but only because he had decided she would be. For over 30 years, Julian had worked the grounds of a quiet, sprawling cemetery on the north shore of Illinois. He knew its secrets, not the spooky kind, but the real kind. He knew which headstones would lean after a hard rain, which paths held water, and which of the ancient oak trees would drop their branches in a high wind. He'd started the job a young man, back when he thought the world made perfect sense. Now, in the early 1990s, his hands were stained with dirt, and his beliefs were just as simple. He believed in what he could see, touch, and fix with a shovel. Every Halloween, the stories would start up again. New security guards, mostly kids, would get spooked by a shadow and start whispering about the woman in white. Julian would hear them as he made his rounds, the sound of his boots crunching on the gravel path, the only thing he needed to hear. He'd just shake his head. In 30 years, every strange noise had turned out to be a branch, an animal, or the wind. He dealt in facts. The night before Halloween, Julian was near the main gates doing a final check. The old streetlights overhead gave off their usual weak yellow light. That's when he saw her. Down the path, a woman in a long white dress standing near the oldest mausoleums. He figured she was a visitor who'd gotten turned around and was trying to find her way out after closing. He called out to her, but she just turned and walked quickly into the shadows between the stone buildings. He went to go check, but she was gone. He just shrugged. Kids sometimes dared each other to sneak in. He figured she'd hopped a fence and ran off when she heard him coming. He didn't think twice about it. The next night, Halloween, the wind was making a racket, a low moan that rattled the leaves. Julian was in the same spot near the gates when he saw a figure. He froze. It was the same woman, same white dress, same spot. A little chill went down his spine. He called out again, his voice sharp this time. She didn't respond. He started walking toward her, his heavy work boots loud on the gravel. But the closer he got, the stranger things felt. She turned toward the shadows, just like the night before. But this time, she didn't walk. She glided into the darkness with a speed that wasn't humanly possible. Julian rushed to where he'd seen her. But when he got there, the place where she'd vanished, the wind just stopped. 1 second it was howling. The next, there was nothing. A complete heavy silence fell over the area. It felt wrong, like the air had turned to wool, muffling everything. The only sound left was the hard, fast thump of his own heart against his ribs. Seeing her once was nothing, but seeing her again, and the way she moved, that was something else entirely. He called Margaret, the cemetery manager. She was a practical woman who ran the place with ledgers and hard facts. In the brightly lit office, she could see he was rattled. He told her what happened, starting with the woman he'd seen the night before, the one he'd dismissed. Then he told her about seeing the exact same woman again, about the impossible way she moved, and the impossible quiet that followed. Margaret listened, wrote it all down, and filed it in the logbook under nighttime weather disturbance. She told Julian he'd been working too hard, but the fact it happened twice had put a new, cold feeling in Julian's gut. Julian's story wasn't the last one. Over the next 10 years, a pattern started to form, one entry at a time in the office logbook. Little things, all of them easy to dismiss on their own. One of the younger groundskeepers swore he heard someone whisper his name on the wind, so faint he thought he'd imagined it. A security guard saw a flicker of white in his headlights as he drove past the gates, a movement so quick it was like a trick of the eye. Another reported a sudden deep cold settling over his car on a warm summer night, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather and fogged up his windows from the inside. Margaret's logbook filled up with practical explanations. Electrical malfunction for flickering lights near the gate. Sudden temperature drop for the guard's strange chill. High winds causing auditory illusions. But all the reports kept happening in the same area. The woman in white was no longer a story Julian told. She was becoming a file, a collection of documented problems that had no sensible solution. By the late 1990s, The cemetery had a brand new security camera system. The night guard was a young guy named Edward, a kid who believed in technology. He trusted hard drives and digital proof more than ghost stories. He was watching the monitor for the main gate one night, drinking coffee to stay awake, when he saw it. A blurry shape that moved across the screen. It was faint, almost transparent, and it moved in a jerky, unnatural way, like the camera couldn't quite keep up with it. Edward's heart hammered in his chest. He fumbled for a thumb drive, jamming it into the recording deck. He managed to copy a few seconds of the feed before the screen filled with static and the word glitch appeared in block letters. He ripped the drive out and ran to find Julian. They watched it together on an old office laptop. The video was grainy. It showed a few frames of a shimmering, indistinct shape gliding past the gate before the image dissolved into a mess of digital snow. For Edward, the glitch was the terrifying part. For Julian, seeing it on a screen, captured by a machine, was all the proof he ever needed. They called Margaret in. She watched the short clip 3 times. Her face went pale, not with fear, but with the frustration of seeing something her practical mind couldn't process. Edward kept saying, "It wasn't a glitch. It was saving a file." That's what it was doing, saving a file Margaret had no explanation. The file, corrupted as it was undeniable. Julian's skepticism was gone for good. It hadn't been replaced with fear, but with a strange kind of certainty. He knew some things just didn't have answers. When the next Halloween came, he decided to wait for her. He went to the main gate alone, carrying a new digital video recorder. The wind died and every cricket went silent. The world seemed to be holding its breath. In that sudden quiet, he heard a sound. It was a low, steady tone, like a single, sad note being held somewhere far away. And she appeared, closer than ever before. Her white dress seemed to catch the moonlight. She looked right at him. Her face was perfectly clear. It wasn't angry or frightening. It was just filled with a deep, endless sorrow. She raised a hand toward him, as if she was asking for something. A feeling washed over Julian, a powerful wave of sadness that wasn't his own. It was a heavy, cold weight that settled on his shoulders, a feeling of loss so immense it made his own life feel small. He didn't feel scared. He just stood there, the recorder in his hand, and watched her. She held his gaze for a moment, then slowly backed away into the shadows and disappeared. The wind started up again, and the low, sad tone was gone. Julian looked down at the recorder in his hand. The red light was still on. It had been working perfectly the whole time. But when he played it back, there was nothing. The screen just showed the empty gate and a few leaves blowing across the path. The microphone had recorded only the sound of the wind. Later, in the office, Margaret laid everything out on her desk. The logbook with a decade of strange reports, Edward's corrupted video file, and now Julian's final, empty recording. They didn't talk about stress or tricks of the light anymore. They had a case file on the impossible, a documented history of something they would never understand. The legend of the woman in white was no longer a story told by kids to spook each other. It was a quiet, documented fact. A presence proven not by a scream, but by a strange silence and a digital glitch. The cemetery was still a place of work for Julian. But now he knew he wasn't just a groundskeeper. He was the archivist for a ghost. He had looked for a rational explanation and, in its place, had found a legend that all the evidence told him was true. Patrolling a cemetery wasn't the job Deputy Graham imagined when he joined the force. Halloween night, 1978, and his beat was a silent city of stone out in the desolate stretches of southeast Idaho. He was young, sure of the world, and this assignment felt like a punchline. He swept his flashlight over the cold markers, each one a monument to a story that was long over. To him, this was just a place, a plot of land where things ended. His partner for the shift was a groundskeeper named Monroe, a man who seemed to have been there for 40 years and would likely be there for 40 more. Monroe moved with a quiet purpose, his silence a part of the landscape. "Just keep your wits about you," the old man had advised earlier, his voice a low rumble. "Tonight's the night this place remembers it has a reputation." Graham just gave a tight smile. A reputation was why he was here officially. Being the newest deputy, he'd drawn the short straw after a few scattered reports of trespassing had come in over the last month. His sergeant had called them disturbances, but clearly thought it was just local kids. "Go check it out, rookie," his boss had said. So here he was, a glorified security guard for a ghost story. He was a man who trusted what he could see and write in a report, not local legends about a gateway to hell. Monroe stopped. "This is the spot," he said, his light settling on a plain patch of earth. "It always starts here." A feeling of profound wrongness washed over Graham. It wasn't just the chill in the air, it was a deep internal cold that logic couldn't touch. The distant sounds of civilization seemed to vanish, replaced by a strange pressure building in his ears. The town's church bell began to toll in the distance, marking midnight. It started as a low, indistinct murmur from under the ground. Then the sound that would derail Graham's life rose from the earth. It was a scream, a raw, inhuman shriek of pure agony that tore through the air. It didn't sound like it came from a person or an animal. It sounded like the ground itself was in pain. Graham's blood ran cold. He fumbled for his radio, his voice a dry rasp. "Dispatch, we have a disturbance. Source unknown." When other deputies arrived, there was nothing. The sound was gone. The air was just air. Graham saw the knowing looks and patient smiles. It was a Halloween prank to them. His official report was logged with a simple, dismissive note. No source found. After they left, the real fear began. A sudden gust of wind slammed a metal gate shut with a deafening clang. Pockets of intense cold seemed to drift past them in the dark. A wrench slid off a nearby toolbox and hit the ground with a sharp crack. When Graham finally decided to leave, his truck's engine sputtered once and died. It wouldn't turn over. One day later, Graham turned in his badge. His resignation letter offered no clear reason, just a reference to an experience he could not explain. The file was closed. Years passed until a journalist named Lena started digging into the legend in the early 1980s. In the county archives, she found the pattern of Halloween reports. In the Historical Society, she found the resignation letters. One letter from an old groundskeeper mentioned seeing vehicles on the access road at odd hours. This was the first detail that didn't fit the ghost story. Her interview with the now haunted Graham confirmed the terror, but it was that one detail, the strange vehicles, that began to shift her focus from the supernatural to the secret. Armed with this suspicion, Lena went to the cemetery on Halloween night. She found Monroe, who just gave her a slow, knowing nod. At midnight, the screaming started, just as the report said. It was horrifying. A sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the soul. Lena searched frantically in the dark with a flashlight, but found nothing. No speakers, no wires, no source. Just the cold ground and the terrible sound. She left frustrated but not defeated. An entire year went by. Lena's investigation hit a wall. There were no public records connecting the cemetery to any suspicious activity. The story went cold, but she didn't let it go. The next Halloween she returned. Again, Monroe was there, a silent sentinel. The church bell tolled midnight, and the screaming began. This time, Lena didn't run towards it. She stayed hidden, watching, listening. The inhuman wail went on for nearly 10 minutes, then abruptly stopped. In the ringing silence that followed, Lena saw it. A flicker of movement near the plot Monroe had pointed out to Graham years ago. She moved closer, staying in the shadows of the old stones. 2 men were there, dressed in dark work clothes. They were packing up equipment, not shovels, but strange-looking electronic devices and spools of cable. They moved with a quick, disciplined efficiency. Lena stepped out of the shadows. "What was that sound?" she asked, her voice steady. The 2 men froze. They looked at each other, a quick, alarmed glance. They said nothing, simply hastening their work, packing the last of the gear into heavy-duty cases. Lena took another step forward. "I was here last year," she prodded. "I heard it then, too." One of the men stopped. He was young, fit, with a high and tight military haircut. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable, but his voice carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "Do not come around here again," he said, his tone low and absolute. He picked up the last case. "This is off-limits for local military authorities." Without another word, they turned and disappeared into the darkness. Lena stood frozen in the sudden, heavy silence. The truth settled in her gut, cold and hard. This wasn't a ghost story. It was something worse. It was human. She didn't know what the experiment was, what those screams really were, or why it was happening in this forgotten place. She only knew what she had seen. Disciplined men with strange equipment, and a warning that felt less like a threat and more like a line being drawn. She understood in that moment that she would never get any more answers. To keep digging would be to invite a kind of attention she could not handle. Lena got in her car, drove away from that cemetery, and never returned. The story she had uncovered never saw the ink of a printing press. It became a tale told in quiet, hushed tones to a few close friends who would listen. For all she knew, the screaming stopped for good that night. Or perhaps it didn't. Lena would never know for sure. She had looked behind a curtain that was never meant to be lifted, and she had seen enough. It was late October, 1863, up in northern Maine. The air was cold, the kind that got right into your bones and stayed there. It carried the smell of wet dirt and dying leaves, the official scent of any graveyard getting ready for winter. This was a quiet, lonely place, but that fall, it became the setting for a story that people around here still don't like to tell after dark. It's the story of Genevieve, a young woman who was pronounced dead from an illness nobody could name. 1 minute she was breathing, the next she was still. So still, the family doctor said she was gone. For most, that would be the end of the story. But for her husband, a man named Blackwood, it was the beginning of a whole new kind of fear. Back then, the fear of being buried alive was a real and terrible thing. Stories were everywhere, whispered from town to town, of people waking up in the dark 6 feet under. Blackwood couldn't get those stories out of his head. He refused to let Genevieve be put in a simple box. He paid extra for what they called a safety coffin. It was a strange thing. Looked like any other coffin, but it had a small brass bell mounted on the lid, right above the ground. A cord ran from that bell down through the wood and was placed in the hands of the person inside. The idea was simple. If you woke up, you pulled the cord, you rang the bell, you were saved. Most folks thought it was a waste of money, just playing on fear. Blackwood didn't care. They buried her on Halloween night. The few people there moved like ghosts in the fading light. The coffin went into the ground, and the sound of shovels scraping and dumping dirt was the only noise. The final thud of dirt on the lid felt heavy. Final. Blackwood himself placed a small lantern by the headstone. Its little flame flickered, a tiny spot of light in the growing darkness. He just stood there, staring at that little bell, his wife's only connection to the world of the living. The first night fell, and a young groundskeeper named Thorne was on watch. He was new to the job, still getting used to the deep silence and the long shadows the moon cast through the crooked trees. The only sound was the steady crunch of his own boots on the gravel path. A cold wind moved through the pine trees, making a low sighing sound. As he passed the new grave, he heard something else. It was a tiny metallic sound, a single faint tink. He stopped dead. The sound was so small he thought he'd imagined it. He listened, holding his breath, but heard nothing more than the wind. He figured it was just the new rope settling, or a twig falling on the bell. He tried to put it out of his mind, but it stayed with him. Later that night, he mentioned it to his boss, an old, hard-faced man named Augustus. Augustus just let out a short, barking laugh. "The wind plays tricks on you out here, boy," he grumbled, not even looking up from his desk. "Get back to your rounds." The second night was colder. The wind was sharper. Thorne did his patrol, trying his best to stay away from the new grave, but he knew he had to check the grounds. As he got closer, he heard it again. This time it wasn't a trick. It was a clear, deliberate sound carried on the wind. Ding, ding. A pause, then another. Ding. It was weak, but it was real. A cold feeling washed through him, sharp and unpleasant. This was not the wind. Someone was ringing that bell. He ran to find Augustus, his heart pounding against his ribs. He explained what he heard, how it was a clear signal this time. The old man slammed his hand down on his desk, his face turning red with anger. "I've worked in this cemetery for 30 years, Augustus snarled. "I've heard every bump and whistle the night has to offer. It's nothing. If I hear one more word from you about fairy tales and ringing bells, you'll be looking for a new job come morning. Do you understand me?" Thorne just nodded, the cold feeling in his gut getting worse. He walked away, feeling trapped. He went back out, pulled by a force he didn't understand. From across the cemetery, he saw a dark figure standing by Genevieve's grave. It was Blackwood. The husband had come back, and as Thorne watched, he saw Blackwood's head snap up, looking around in the darkness. He had heard it too. Their eyes met across the field of stone markers. They didn't say a word, but in that one look they shared the same terrible knowledge. The sound was real. By the third night, the sound was no longer quiet or timid. It was a frantic, desperate clamor. The bell was ringing without pause, a constant, high-pitched peal that cut through the silence of the cemetery. It was the sound of pure panic. Blackwood was there, and he'd brought a few other family members with him. They begged Augustus and the cemetery director to do something, to dig her up. The director was a man who cared more about rules than anything else. He refused to disturb a grave in the dead of night. They would wait, he said, until morning. As the small crowd stood there in the freezing dark, forced to listen to the non-stop ringing, the sound seemed to get louder, faster, a frantic heartbeat from beneath the earth. It was a scream you could hear. And then, all at once, it stopped. The sudden silence was more horrifying than the ringing had ever been. It was a deep, total quiet that felt like an answer. The air grew heavy and still. There was nothing left to do but wait for the sun. As the first weak, gray light of morning finally broke through the trees, the diggers arrived. Their faces were grim. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered, their voices low whispers. The only real sounds were the hard scrapes of the shovels hitting dirt and rock, and the heavy breathing of the men as they worked. They finally lifted the coffin out of the earth, its wooden sides caked in mud. Blackwood fell to his knees beside it, his hands shaking as he helped pry open the lid. What they saw inside was a nightmare. The soft satin lining of the coffin was torn to shreds. The wood on the inside of the lid was covered in deep scratches, splintered and raw. Genevieve's fingernails were broken and bloody. The bell cord was pulled tight and wrapped around her hand, which was frozen in a desperate grip. Her body was twisted into a position that spoke of a terrible, violent struggle. She had not died peacefully. Dr. Whitlock arrived soon after. He was a man of science, calm and professional, but when he looked into the coffin, he physically recoiled. The proof was right there. His formal examination later confirmed what everyone who saw her already knew. Genevieve had been alive when she was buried. The state of her body and the inside of the coffin showed she had fought for air, for escape, for at least 2 days before finally suffocating in the dark. The story of what happened on those 3 nights became a legend, a grim warning whispered in the town for generations. The other safety coffins in the cemetery were quietly removed. They didn't need a bell to remind them of the horrors that can lie buried just beneath your feet. Cold came up from the ground first. It was a wet, seeping cold that seemed to rise from the boggy earth of the plateau and cling right to the skin. Mr. Samuel, the supervising teacher, was counting heads. He did it every time the group stopped. A simple habit. His lips moved without a sound, his breath puffing out in small white clouds in the October air. All around him, 44 high school students stood huddled together. Their usual noisy energy had been stolen by the deepening chill. He got to 45. He stopped, a deep line forming between his eyebrows. He counted again, faster this time, his voice a low, worried sound under the constant rush of wind through the stunted spruce trees. 45. No, 44. He looked up, his eyes finding the other chaperone, and in the silence that passed between them, a simple mistake turned into a serious problem. The group was 1 person short. Liam was gone. Hours before, the day had been simple. It was the last week of October in 1981, and the air in the Monongahela National Forest had the clean, sharp scent of pine and damp soil. 45 students were on an ecology field trip, a day meant to teach them about the wild beauty of West Virginia. It was never meant to be a lesson in how easily the wilderness can take something away. Liam, only 15, was all motion and energy. He had a habit of wandering a little ahead of everyone, always eager to get a closer look at some strange rock or twisted tree. His bright flannel shirt was a slash of color against the muted browns and grays of the autumn trail. They had been hiking for hours, moving across a high exposed plateau, a strange place of sharp, rocky outcrops and ground that could turn suddenly to cold, muddy bog. Around 3 in the afternoon, the trail widened into a vast, open space. Sarah, one of the other students, remembered seeing Liam jog ahead. He wanted to get a picture of a weird cluster of trees off to the side of the path. She heard the small mechanical click of his camera's shutter. It was a perfectly normal sound, a little noise that was supposed to capture a memory. A moment later, she looked up from tying her boot. He just wasn't there anymore. In the open air of the plateau, a person doesn't just disappear, but he did. She hadn't thought much of it then. Liam was always wandering. He'd catch up. Except this time, he didn't. The first search was just panicked shouting. Mr. Samuel and the chaperones yelled Liam's name until their throats were raw. Their voices were eaten by the wind, swallowed by the sheer size of the woods around them. It was a helpless, frustrating noise. They were on a high, wide-open trail, but just feet below the path in any direction were deep, unmarked ravines and chasms hidden by thick brush. A single wrong step was all it would take. By nightfall, what started as a school's problem became a massive operation. The U.S. Forest Service and the state police arrived, their trucks kicking up gravel on the remote access roads. Search dogs were let loose, their barks and whines echoing strangely in the quiet woods as their handlers shouted commands. The forest floor came alive with the beams of powerful headlamps, the lights dancing and crossing through the trees like lost spirits. Volunteers from nearby towns showed up, their faces grim. They formed long lines, shoulder to shoulder, to sweep the woods in methodical grids. They moved slowly, their boots sinking into the cold mud, pushing through dense thickets of rhododendron that clawed at their clothes. Then the temperature plummeted. A thick, freezing mist rolled in off the peaks, a thing the locals called a ghost fog. It wasn't normal fog. It clung to everything, heavy and wet, turning the entire landscape into a silent, suffocating tomb. It muffled sound and made it impossible to see more than 10 feet ahead. Sergeant Rourke, the lead investigator, later talked about the silence. He said with hundreds of people combing the area, with dogs and all that activity, there should have been some sound. But the fog seemed to deaden everything. All you could hear was your own breathing and the drip of water from the trees. Not a cry for help, not the snap of a twig. Nothing. Liam had vanished as if he'd been erased. The search became a desperate struggle against an environment that felt like it was actively hiding him. For days, the search continued. It grew into weeks. Helicopters were brought in, their rotors beating the cold air in a frantic, loud rhythm as they flew low over the plateau. But they saw nothing. The official search turned up not one single piece of evidence. Not his backpack, not his camera, not even a clear footprint. The complete lack of any sign became its own kind of terrible evidence. It was a chilling testament to the absolute power of the forest. The police had their official theories, of course. Maybe he stepped too close to the edge of a hidden mine shaft. Maybe he'd fallen into the freezing bog water, and hypothermia had taken him in minutes. A strange report from a hunter added a darker possibility. He'd seen an old, battered, dark-colored pickup truck idling on a logging road not far from the trail. A rumor started to spread that the truck belonged to a reclusive local woman named Darlene, who was known to be fiercely territorial. Nothing was ever proven. The police could never find the truck or the driver. It was just another dead end, another question without an answer. The news crews that had gathered at the base of the mountain packed up their cameras. The volunteers went back to their jobs. The case file on Liam's disappearance grew thicker, then gathered dust on a shelf. Eventually, the search was officially called off. The authorities promised they'd keep the case open, but everyone knew what that meant. The forest had won. Over time, Liam's story was absorbed by the region, becoming another piece of local lore, joining the tales of miners and loggers lost to the unforgiving terrain. People whispered about spirits and the strange fog, creating spooky stories to explain the unexplainable. But those stories offered no comfort. They were a cold substitute for the truth, a way to turn a family's tragedy into a local ghost story. The real horror wasn't in the woods. It was in the quiet house a few towns over where Liam's parents waited. For them, the search never ended. His mother kept his flannel shirt hanging on the back of his bedroom door for years, a bright patch of color in a room that would never be used again. His father walked the trails of that same forest every weekend until his legs grew too weak, calling his son's name into the wind, hoping for an answer that would never come. They never moved away, always staying close to the phone, holding on to the impossible hope that one day it would ring and a voice would finally tell them what happened to their boy. The mystery of the disappearance became a public story, but the pain was a private, unending silence. A wound that could never heal because there was no grave to visit, no final answer, and no peace. There was only the empty space he left behind, a space as vast and as cold as the wilderness that took him. On October 31st, 1928, Deputy Harlan Finch believed the world was a place that made sense. It was built on rules you could count on. His partner, Deputy Farrow, was a different story. Farrow sat across from him in the back of the sheriff's Ford, a bundle of nerves, staring out at the dark Ozark woods like he expected something to leap out of them. Sheriff Hayes had laid it out for them. "Boone's got his moonshine operation in Devil's Backbone Hollow," he'd grumbled. "He's pushing more whiskey than anyone. Now you listen. Folks out there tell stories about some hog caller in the woods. It's nonsense. Ghost stories to keep folks away. You go in, find that still, and you bring Boone back. Don't you worry about ghosts. You worry about guns." They were dropped off where the dirt road ended. A fog so thick it felt like wet cotton swallowed them whole, eating any sound except the damp hiss of leaves under their boots. The quiet felt heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. Soon they saw strange, twisted figures hanging from low branches, crude things made of corn husks and animal bones. It was a clear warning to turn back. They found the still tucked back in a drawer. The fire was out, but a faint warmth still rose from the ashes. They had just missed them. Then Farrow made a choked sound and pointed. In the soft mud near the dark opening of a mine shaft were huge footprints with 3 long toes pressed deep into the earth. Before Harlan could fully process it, a terrible grating roar tore through the woods like rusted metal on bone. The sound hit him like a physical blow, making him flinch and his blood run cold. A huge figure crashed out of the trees, screaming that awful sound. For a split second, all of Harlan's logic vanished, replaced by a pure, animal fear. His mind raced to catch up, screaming that it was a man in a costume, a cheap trick with stilts and furs. But that rational thought was drowned out by the sheer viciousness of its movement and the guttural, inhuman roar that seemed to shake the very ground. The thing wasn't just a man in a suit. It was a vision of pure malice. Terror seized him, sharp and absolute. His hand shook as he drew his pistol, firing on pure instinct. The gunshots were swallowed by the damp air. Farrow, already primed for terror, saw the demon from the stories. The sight simply broke him. He turned and ran. Harlan, his own heart hammering against his ribs, grabbed his partner's arm, his own frantic escape tangled up with dragging the whimpering Farrow with him. They crashed through the underbrush together, running from a thing that had terrified them both. The creature chased them until they splashed across a creek bed. Then the roaring stopped. The hollow was silent again. Back at the station, Farrow was a haunted man, but Harlan was quiet, hiding a deep unease he'd never felt before. He was spooked, and he hated it. Sheriff Hayes slammed his fist on his desk. "It was a man in a suit, you hear me? One of Boone's thugs. I won't have my deputies run out of the woods by a ghost story." He pointed a thick finger at them both. "Tomorrow, at dawn, you're going back. You'll find his costume or his stilts or whatever other tricks he used." He stared hard at Farrow. "And you're going to face it." The next morning, Harlan needed to go back as much as Farrow dreaded it. He had to prove the fear he felt was just a reaction to a clever trick. He had to put the monster back in its box. The hollow was just as menacing in the gray daylight. Every shadow seemed to move. Finally, under a rock ledge, they found it. The furs, the stilts, the megaphone. Harlan felt a wave of relief so strong his knees almost buckled. Pharaoh stared at the mundane objects, the terror on his face finally breaking. As Harlan documented the props, Pharaoh called out, "Harlan, look at this!" Half buried in the mud was a small, tarnished silver locket. Harlan took it and pried it open. Inside was a tiny, faded picture of a woman and a child. He remembered a missing persons report from a town over. The description matched. The relief he'd just felt curdled into a new, colder dread. A faint, sweet, and metallic smell of decay drifted from the dark mouth of the nearby mine shaft. This wasn't just about protecting whiskey anymore. The man they were hunting, the man in the costume, was more than just a thug. He was a killer. Their mission changed. They were hunting a man. 2 days later, they found him in a boarding house just outside the county line. A quiet, unassuming drifter named Virgil. The arrest was quiet. He didn't fight. He just smiled. During the interrogation, the full truth was laid bare. Virgil confessed Boone hired him to protect the whiskey still. The hog collar costume was his idea, a way to use local superstition. But sometimes scaring people wasn't enough. Sometimes, Virgil explained with a chilling calm, it was just easier to kill them. The job was to keep the hollow clear, and a dead man tells no tales. Then he smiled, admitting it was the part he truly enjoyed. The search of the old mines confirmed the true scale of his horror. They found what was left of 11 people. There were men who had likely stumbled too close to the still, women whose disappearances had been mysteries for years, and the remains of a child, whose locket had finally brought the truth to light. As the case files were stamped closed, Harlan looked out at the quiet Ozark hills, but he no longer saw peace. He saw a landscape full of dark places, perfect for hiding secrets. Harlan knows his case is not an anomaly. The 18th Amendment fueled a black market that led to a 24% overall rise in crime nationwide, including a 12.7% surge in the U.S. homicide rate during the Prohibition era. The terror he found in Devil's Backbone Hollow was merely one hidden chapter in a national bloodbath. He now understood a chilling lesson. The real monsters don't need ghost stories to hide behind. Sometimes, all they need is a good excuse. Harper, Walsh, Klein, and Bell were huddled together on the dark cabin floor, their own ragged breathing the only sound in a terrifying new silence. Just moments before, a deep, rhythmic thumping hammered against the outside walls. Thump, thump, thump. The sound shook the very floorboards, followed by the awful splintering crack of wood as something tried to force the front door. Now all that noise was gone. But a suffocating stillness had taken its place, leaving only the chilling certainty that whatever it was still right on the other side of that heavy oak door. Walsh's voice was the first to break the quiet, and it came out as a ragged whisper. "What was that?" No one answered. What could they say? They just sat there in the dark, every muscle tight, listening for something, anything. But the world outside had gone dead. No wind, no crickets, not even the normal creaks and groans you'd expect from an old cabin. The silence itself felt wrong, like holding your breath and waiting for a blow to land. It was supposed to have been a simple weekend, a cheap getaway for Halloween for 4 West Virginia University students who were sick of their dorms in Morgantown. Klein had an old Ford Bronco that could handle any road, and Harper had found the rental online. It was a historic cabin, he'd said, tucked away in the Monongahela National Forest. He was the type to get excited about old stories of loggers and pioneers. The rest of them just wanted a place to drink a few beers and forget about midterm exams. The drive should have been a warning. The highway narrowed to a two-lane road, then that road turned to gravel. Soon enough, the gravel disappeared, and they were on a muddy, rutted-out logging trail that was barely a road at all. The last few miles were a crawl, the bronco bucking and lurching. Tree branches, bare and black, scraped along the sides of the truck. The sound was like long, sharp fingernails dragging across the metal. When the cabin finally came into view, it looked like it had grown right out of the dark woods. It was older and rougher than the pictures had shown. The wood of the walls was nearly black from a century of rain and snow. The front door was a beast, a thick slab of dark oak. It looked like a bear had tried to tear its way through it, not just once, but over and over again. Deep, jagged scars covered it from top to bottom. The inside wasn't any friendlier. A deep, damp smell of rotting leaves and old wood hung in the air. Klein, ever the practical one, went straight for the big stone fireplace and got a fire going to chase out the chill. But it didn't work. Not really. Harper noticed it first, a spot a few feet from the hearth that stayed cold, not just cool but freezing. You could have the fire roaring hot enough to make you sweat, but if you walked through that spot, a deep, unnatural cold would go right through you. It was a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. Walsh felt it too. She took one look at the large, curtainless window that stared out into the black woods and sat down on the other side of the room, turning her back to it. Later that night, things started to get worse. Bell, a journalism major, had brought a small cassette recorder, thinking it would be funny to tape them telling ghost stories. While playing it back for a laugh, a new sound came through the tiny speaker. It was a thin, miserable wail, like a woman crying from a great distance, a sound so full of old pain it made the hair on their arms stand up. Klein slammed the stop button. "What the hell was that?" he asked. Their drunken smiles were gone. Harper told him to rewind it and play that spot again. They all leaned in, listening intently. This time, there was nothing, just their own slurred voices, followed by a bit of static. They played it back a third time. Still nothing. The wailing sound was just gone. After an uneasy moment, Belle shrugged. "We're just drunk," she said, forcing a laugh. "We're hearing things." They wanted to believe her, so they put the recorder away and dealt out a hand of cards to forget it. They were trying to forget about it with a game of cards when a sudden crash of glass made them all jump. An old, empty bottle that had been sitting on the high mantel over the fireplace had fallen onto the stone hearth, shattering. No one had been anywhere near it. Klein let out a tense breath. "Just the house settling," he said, a little too quickly. "Old cabins make noise." It probably just vibrated off. Harper wasn't so sure. He'd noticed that bottle earlier, and it had seemed stable, set far back from the edge. But he kept quiet. It could have just fallen. Still, after that, a new tension settled over the room. They couldn't shake the feeling that the crash had been intentional, that they were being watched. The real terror began around 1 in the morning. It started with a heavy, rhythmic thumping against the outside walls. It was a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the floorboards. It sounded like something enormous was circling the cabin, methodically banging against the wood with its own body. The windows rattled with each impact. Klein, fed up and trying to be brave, grabbed a heavy flashlight and said he was going to check it out. He pulled the heavy door open and stepped onto the porch, and the sound immediately stopped. The silence rushed in. He swept the flashlight beam across the trees and the muddy ground. There was nothing. No animal, no person, no tracks, not even a broken twig, which brought them back to now. Huddled on the floor in the dark. The fire had burned down to a dull red glow. Walsh, unable to calm down, had crept back over to the far side of the room. She risked a glance toward the big, dark window, and she saw it. A figure, standing just inside the line of trees. It was a woman deathly pale. She was dressed in faded, heavy period clothing, the kind you'd see in photos from the mid-1800s. She was completely still, watching them with empty, dark eyes. Walsh tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was locked in place. The pale woman slowly, deliberately, lifted a thin, white arm and pointed. She wasn't pointing at Walsh or at the window. She was pointing directly at the scarred front door. Then she dissolved back into the night. A second later, the scratching started. A grating, scraping sound from the porch, like a heavy rock being dragged across the grain of the wood. The front door began to shudder in its frame, flexing inward as massive, non-human impacts slammed against it from the outside. The scratching turned to a frantic, deep clawing. The old wood groaned and splintered. Something wanted in. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The impacts, the clawing, the noise, all gone. All that was left was the sound of 4 people gasping for air in a silence that felt absolute. They stayed like that until the first hint of gray dawn touched the window. They didn't discuss it. They just moved, throwing their belongings into their bags, their hands shaking. Harper was the last one out of the cabin. As he stepped onto the porch, he looked at the door. The morning light revealed the network of deep, jagged symbols gouged into the wood. They weren't letters or pictures. They were raw, angry marks clawed into the oak. They didn't stop driving until they reached the forest ranger station. They stumbled in, trying to report a break-in, an attack, vandalism. They didn't even know what to call it. The old ranger behind the counter listened, his face giving away nothing. When they were done, he took the cabin key from Harper's trembling hand and dropped it in a drawer. "That cabin," he said, his voice low and tired, like he'd had this conversation before. "It's not haunted. It's owned." He looked at them, his eyes serious. Something in those woods laid a claim on that place a long time ago. Those marks on the door, they aren't a warning. They're a brand, a sign of property. You folks were just trespassing. Weeks later, back at WVU, Harper, driven by fear rather than academic curiosity, couldn't let the ranger's words rest. He found a newspaper clipping in the Intermountain Archives from the 1880s detailing the disappearance of a settler's daughter near Seneca Rocks. An accompanying illustration of a strange warding sign meant to keep dark things away was nearly identical to the scratches on the Hutchinson cabin door, only inverted. A warding sign keeps things out. An inverted one does the opposite. Harper felt a new, deeper fear settle in his bones. He had no idea what he had really seen that night. He didn't know if the pale woman was a prisoner of that place or the reason prisoners were taken. He only knew that the marks on the door weren't a brand of ownership. They were an open invitation.